Our next speaker is Chelsea Dorsett, registered dietitian and lifestyle coach at Huber Personalized Medicine in Cincinnati, Ohio. Ms. Dorsett will share her expertise with us to help us navigate the complicated world of food labels, nutrition blogs, advertising, and media to show us a clear and simple path forward based on real whole foods. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I assume you can all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm really happy to be here and present on something I'm really so passionate about. Again, I'm Chelsea Dorsett. I'm a registered dietitian, and I do work in an integrative functional medical office. So I have the pleasure of getting to do every day what I love to do. It's so fun. So I help patients either lose weight or deal with IBS, or even things like Lyme and cancer, and really help optimize their nutrition. So it's such a fun career. And today I am going to talk about real foods and whole foods, and really kind of the food industry and how it's changed and really how it's impacted our health. So before we dive into that, we're going to do a little exercise that I think is always enlightening. If I asked you to picture the golden arches, you can instantly picture what that looks like, right? Everybody, even kids, can unfortunately picture the golden arches. Or if I asked you to picture what an Oreo looks like, or what the packaging of an Oreo looks like, we instantly would know. Or a third example, if I asked you to close your eyes and picture what the little honeybee looks like on Honey Nut Cheerios, I think majority of Americans could easily get those questions pretty quickly. But if I asked you to pick out, go to Kroger, which is our local grocery store here in Cincinnati, what does Swiss chard look like? A lot of people wouldn't know. Or if I asked you, hey, how do you prepare and cook bok choy? A lot of Americans wouldn't know how to do that. Or if I asked, what season does asparagus grow in? Again, a lot of us wouldn't know that. And so I just find it ironic that the foods that we should be eating and that our body needs to survive, we're almost unfamiliar with today, and how to cook it, how to buy it, how to prepare it, how to even eat it. Whereas those processed foods, they've just been so ingrained into our everyday life. And so I'm definitely going to today talk about the benefits of why you should try to eat majority of your foods from whole, real foods. But before I do that, I kind of want to talk about whole foods' antagonist, which is processed foods, and really just kind of show you a lot of the downsides to eating man-made processed foods. And I think it kind of begs the question, what happened over the last, several centuries and even the last 50 to 100 years? If you look at this man in the middle, he was lean, he has a six-pack, and yet there was no Weight Watchers, there's no points, there's no Fitbit or Peloton, and yet he managed to be really thin and lean and active. And yet most Americans today, despite so many tools, and some people can even...
Are you meaning to share your screen right now?
I'm sorry?
Are you meaning to share your screen right now?
Yes.
All right, you need to share your screen still.
You can't see my presentation?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I did that. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, thank you for stopping and telling me that. Well, you really didn't miss much. The only thing you really missed was this picture here. So I assume you can see it now with the little guy in the middle and on the very end.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So all I was saying is just a lot of Americans struggle today with something called metabolic syndrome, which is just high blood pressure, high blood sugar, and weight that really has a lot to do with our food supply and what we're eating. And unfortunately, the last several decades, this was what was recommended to us, was to eat to eat a lot of processed foods, a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of man-made crackers and breads and muffins, and this is where we were told to get a lot of our calories from, 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates, whereas they were telling us, oh, don't eat a lot of fat, and equal fruits and vegetables, when really this should be kind of flipped upside down. But the good thing is today, this isn't the standard recommendation, but overall, this is what was the real recommendation for decades for us as Americans, and we followed suit. And that's when we really saw a really huge increase in heart disease and high blood sugar and high blood pressure. I was at the grocery store the other day and just kind of getting my normal things, fruits and vegetables and meat, and the cashier asked me if I was doing an experiment or something. And I just thought that was so sad and funny at the same time, because we can't even really recognize whole real food if it hits us in the face. And I had an eggplant or something kind of weird, and she didn't know what it was to ring it up. So I just tell you that story because, again, it's to me, it's just, I feel we are so distant from whole real foods that we don't even really recognize it when it kind of hits us in the face. So again, I'm talking a little bit about processed foods before I transition into what whole foods is and how to incorporate that in your life. But when I say the word processed foods, there's definitely a spectrum. So of course, for example, protein powder, if you're making a protein shake, that's technically processed, but so is a ho-ho and a Twinkie. So when I'm talking about processed foods today, I'm really referring to the ultra processed man-made foods, Twinkies, ho-hos, cereal, that sort of foods. I don't expect perfection out of my patients. I don't expect everybody to be picking their food from their backyard and growing everything and eating squirrel and killing everything, all of your meat. It's okay, in my opinion, to have some of those things that are a little bit processed, yeah, but they're not like ho-hos and Twinkies. So if you have, a good quality protein powder with some, kale and blueberries, that's okay. So again, today I'm really talking about the ultra processed foods and comparing them to real whole foods. So before we dive in, and I'm really glad that you told me you couldn't see my PowerPoint because this is going to be important for you to see, we'll play a little game and it's called Name That Food. And I know all of you are on mute right now, but if you take a look at this slide, this is ingredients to something very processed. And of course, I took away all of the marketing and the labeling on it and just had the ingredients on there. So if anyone can guess what this is, typically I do this before, I've done this before, no one can really guess, but this is a lean cuisine. Look at all these ingredients. I mean, there are at least 50 ingredients in here, and we're ingesting this and expecting our body to try to detox this. I'll do one more, and this actually had to go on 2 slides because the ingredients was so lengthy, I couldn't fit it onto one slide. So this is the first slide, and then this is the second slide. And again, this is all the same thing. So I'll go back to the first, you'll probably never guess it. This is a KFC Chicken Pot Pie. Look at all these ingredients. I mean, isn't that it's just horrifying, I think. And it's no wonder why we eat these foods and then, oh gosh, at 2 in the afternoon, we feel tired and sluggish and bloated and we have eczema and acne, and our bodies are really trying to detox this. And I think, gosh, you wouldn't even give this to your dog if you had the opportunity. One of my patients, he actually, ironically, works in a processed food factory for a specific company, and he works with the blue dyes that go in like gushers and things like that. And he tells me he has to wear a full-on hazmat suit. And I'm just shocked by that the foods that we're putting in our body, he has to wear a full hazmat suit on when he works with that. And another example of just how many ingredients we're getting in our food supply, I did a little survey with my patients and just had them write down what they're eating. And I counted on average, most Americans or most of my patients were getting about 300 ingredients per day in their food, per day. And really, it should be more like 30, maybe 40, with spices. But it just goes to show you we're, again, so accustomed to eating these quick, easy, convenient foods. And so just a few bullet points on the downsides of processed foods. And there's a lot of science to support this. In general, a lot of processed foods like potato chips and ho-hos and Twinkies and Oreos, they do turn to sugar very quick in our body, and they really leave us wanting more. It's actually, in my opinion, flat out addicting. And that the Pringles saying, once you pop the top, you can't stop, is so true, right? It's so true. they're very low in nutrients, and they might advertise to you, hey, you can get your vitamin D or calcium through this, ho-ho or Twinkie. But the reality is it's fortified. It's not a lot of nutrients, and it's not very bioavailable, meaning your body doesn't really know how to actually intake that specific vitamin D that they put in that food. Most often it leaves you feeling more hungry. And even interestingly enough, food processing companies add something called phosphoric acid to help preserve the food, which is why you can have a can of soup sit on your shelf for 2 or 3 years. I always tell my patients that calories don't matter when you're eating real foods. It's so easy to sit down and have 1,000 calories worth of Cheez-Its, but if I asked you to eat 1,000 calories worth of grass-fed beef, that would be really challenging because you would instantly feel pretty full after you eat about 4 or 5 ounces of steak. Whereas, gosh, I know me, if I start eating Cheez-Its, I cannot stop. And it's designed like that on purpose. So what is the perfect diet? And we're going to get into that a little bit, but really I'm going to go through the next half of this presentation on just really showing you the benefits of whole foods and how to incorporate them into your day-to-day life. Gosh, there's so many different diets out there, right? There's paleo and keto and Whole30. And I'm here today to not tell you, you need to do this specific diet. It really needs to be a kind of a return to tradition of just eat whole, real foods. And don't worry about the calories or the points or weighing your food. The longer I've been a dietitian, the longer I feel like, gosh, it's really more simple than I think we give it credit for. Eating whole, healthy foods and being lean and healthy is simpler than I think we give it credit for. We always want to try to kind of fit our diet or what we're eating into some sort of popular diet. So the more you focus on keeping it real, keeping it simple, minimal ingredients, the healthier you will be every single time. The better you will feel, the more energy you will have, the better you'll sleep. And when I say keep it simple, that does not mean keep it boring, because I know sometimes that notion of a diet can be boiled broccoli and boiled chicken, and that's boring, but it doesn't have to be. For example, you can have a nice juicy steak with butter on it and a baked potato and amazing asparagus, wrapped with seasonings and maybe some bacon on there. Or, I mean, think of how decadent and savory these foods can be when you pair them with good vegetables and good healthy fats. I mean, hopefully I'm getting your mouth watering by just talking about this. It does not and should not be just boiled broccoli, because that is boring. You have to spice it up. And again, focus less on counting calories and chasing a certain diet. And the more you focus on eating whole, real foods, the better you will truly feel. So when I keep saying real foods, I know that can even be confusing. What is real foods? And I hope that this helps just kind of outline, here are examples of a few whole, real foods. And some people do different twists on this. Some people decide to be vegetarian or maybe even vegan, or eat a little bit more protein than others, and that's all fine. But to me, at the end of the day, as long as every one of my patients is eating real foods, then I know they're going to get success. So here we've got vegetables, all vegetables. I think that really should be the foundation for everybody's diet. And I think that is the one thing that all dietitians and doctors can agree on, is vegetables are healthy for you. I've never heard anyone say, oh, limit the cabbage. I've just never heard anybody say it. Nuts and seeds and all kinds, not just almonds, but it could be pistachios and hazelnuts, and it could even be peanuts. Fruits, it could be blueberries, blackberries, really any kind of fruit. Healthy fats, I'm a huge fan of healthy fats. And I think in the 1950s, when we started taking away fat from our food supply and we added carbs to it, we began to almost fear fat. And we feared that fat was going to give us a heart attack, and fat was going to cause heart disease. And really, that couldn't be further from the truth. It's the processed carbohydrates and sugar that's to blame. Animal protein, of course, as clean as possible. And I know sometimes it's hard to find grass-fed or wild-caught, but when you can, try to choose those good quality proteins. Again, I know not everybody has access to it, but when you can, definitely try to get good quality protein. Beans, legumes, potato, quinoa, rice. So you see these all are just one ingredient foods that you can make taste amazing with different cooking methods. Here's a few benefits of real foods. They're more satisfying every single time. Just like that example I gave you of you could eat 1,000 calories worth of Cheez-Its, but probably couldn't eat 1,000 calories worth of steak or broccoli or anything like that. I promise you, when you eat real foods, you will feel fuller, longer, you will have less cravings for processed foods, and they're full of actual, true, essential nutrients. Essential nutrients is just a set of nutrients that you have to get from food, that you cannot produce on your own. You have to get it from your diet. And the processed food industry has done a great job of marketing to you that, oh, look, you can get all your vitamins and minerals in this, multi-grain Cheerios, kind of making you think, gosh, well, I'm getting, my vitamin D serving here. When the reality is, and I think this is a perfect example, the amount of vitamin D in this Honey Nut Cheerios or multi-grain Cheerios is very, very small. 100 IUs of vitamin D is really not that much at all. In a tiny piece of 3-ounce salmon, which is about the size of a deck of cards, you can get 5 times the amount of vitamin D, and your body actually knows how to utilize that form of vitamin D. And most people probably eat 5 ounces of salmon, so maybe even a little bigger piece than that. And vitamin D is one that I commonly test on all my patients. And I would say in Ohio, 90% of my patients are low on vitamin D. And that has a huge impact on our immune system, bone, everything, your energy, your blood sugar. It really plays a big role into how you feel. So it doesn't surprise me that if we think we're getting vitamin D through processed foods, we're actually really not. You can get tenfold the amount of vitamin D through not only the sun, but also our food supply. So I just tell you this too, I don't want anybody getting tricked into thinking, gosh, I'm getting all my nutrients. Oh no, you can get tenfold the nutrients in real food, in a kind that's actually bioavailable, meaning your body can actually utilize it. I want to go through some common real food myths, and I think that this can even kind of deter people from eating whole food, and they would prefer a special K-bar versus almonds because they're afraid of the fat. So here's the top 3 that I see. Saturated fat like butter will give you a heart attack, or beef or eggs will give you a heart attack. I hear that often. Or you can only have 6 walnuts because they're high calorie, or only have a quarter of an avocado because they're really high calorie. Or I hear this often, coconut oil will raise your cholesterol and then you'll have a heart attack. And these simply just aren't true. When they did the first studies back in the 1950s on cholesterol and fat and heart disease, they gave rabbits eggs, and it raised their cholesterol. And from that, it was concluded, well, if humans, we're different than rabbits, eat eggs, it's going to raise our cholesterol, which is going to cause a heart attack. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that myth has just lived on for a long time, that, gosh, if I eat these healthy fats, that's what's going to cause heart disease. When again, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's the Cheerios and toast and orange juice and Subway sandwich and potato chips. That food, which is all processed and man-made, that's what's causing heart disease, not the eggs. We're blaming the good guy for something that's not, like I said, couldn't be further from the truth. So hopefully I've laid out 2 things so far. Number one, that we eat a lot of processed foods in general. And hopefully if I can begin to help you switch to whole foods, you will notice a huge difference in your health. And again, hopefully I've really outlined that whole foods are king and they're amazingly beneficial. And this probably honestly wasn't news. I realize that I'm not giving you breaking news that processed foods are bad or sugar is bad. But I totally understand that a lot of us say we don't have time, or it's too expensive, or they don't know how to cook them, or you have a sweet tooth, or you're just too busy. And I can totally understand if this is where you're coming from. I would challenge you to take the opportunity today. If you are feeling bloated or tired, or you can't lose weight, or your joints hurt, or you can't sleep, take this opportunity to start to make some small, tiny changes with your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner. I promise you, any amount that you change will make an impact. And this is your opportunity now to really kind of make some changes. So I know it can be overwhelming, and the list of excuses that we can have can be long, but I'm a big believer that with health, it's definitely the pay me now or pay me later when it comes to health. It's definitely more expensive to have kale than Honey Nut Cheerios, but it's also really expensive to have diabetes or to be on insulin. So I totally get that it can be difficult to change. But what I would challenge you is to get in the game somehow. And that's what I'm going to spend the next few minutes of this presentation showing you how you can start to incorporate real food. So if you're sitting on the sideline saying, gosh, where do I begin? My biggest recommendation for you is do not change everything overnight. Change your breakfast this next month. Just simply start there. That's all you have to do, and get in the game. And it could be even you do frozen vegetables. That would be awesome, because now you're getting vegetables. So here's some how-tos. First of all, I think we have to just eliminate any barriers and remember your body was totally designed to eat real food. It's what it wants, it's what it craves, and it's really the only thing it knows how to metabolize. So here's some very few examples of how to start small. So for example, if you're normally having cereal for breakfast, maybe try hard-boiled eggs with an avocado, or you can do some edamame to get some protein if you want in there, or you can even do some organic chicken sausage. Would be probably just as quick as the cereal. If you're doing McDonald's every day for lunch, try to hop into a grocery store and get some deli meat and cheese. And you might be thinking, but Chelsea, that's processed. It is, but it is definitely better than McDonald's, and it's definitely a step in the right direction. Or if you're doing a special K-bar for snack, try some cashews or pistachios. If you're doing an Egg McMuffin for breakfast, swap it out for a protein shake. So I'll try to help you if you need help. Find some really easy substitutions that don't cost a lot more money, don't cost you a lot of time, but really can give you a big benefit. And as I kind of mentioned throughout this presentation, that there's always good, better, and best options when it comes to food. And I think I would be silly if I expected from my patients or even from myself to always get the 100% best nutrition option. It's just not realistic. There's always, again, good, better, and best. And is a protein shake better than McDonald's? Absolutely. Is scrambled eggs with sauteed mushrooms and spinach better than a protein shake? Absolutely. So start somewhere. And I promise you, within the first month of changing your diet, you will feel clearer thinking, less bloated, less achy, more energy. You will notice the difference. It's very consistent that I see my patients really notice a huge change. So that ends my PowerPoint. Here is my contact information. If you ever have any questions, or if you completely disagree with me, I always like to hear both sides, let me know. Happy to chat through that. And if you want to seek my help out, I'm happy to help you make some small changes. So if there's any questions, happy to take them now. I think people might send some in the comment section, but hopefully it was intriguing and thought-provoking.
Chelsea, thank you so much. If you have questions for Chelsea, please post them in the chat and I'll try to get those answered for you. Chelsea, the question I have is, what do you think about organic versus conventionally grown food?
Great question. I am a big fan of organic. And if we're talking about, let's say, fruits and vegetables, in particular, there are a lot of studies showing that not only are the amount of vitamins and minerals so much more significantly present in organic, but it also is just the amount of pesticides and toxins and herbicides are significantly less in organic. So it is definitely worth it for sure. And there's something called the Dirty Dozen, which you can quickly Google, that has been shown to be the most beneficial in getting organic. And if you get those foods organic, you can reduce your toxic pesticide load by 80% by just getting those foods organic. So I think it's definitely worth it. It is more expensive. And if you had to start somewhere, check out the Dirty Dozen list. That's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think that if people realize that, price is usually the big issue for people, more so than anything. But I think if they look at it as an investment in their health, then it becomes quite worth it. There are so many down the road benefits to eating healthy and avoiding those things, particularly for their children. When children are growing up to be exposed to all the things that we have now in our conventional food system, it's fairly detrimental. I have another question. So, with the global warming issues going on, people are getting into different camps, and, Bill Gates has come out with a book that's saying that in order for us to save the world, we absolutely have to stop eating meat and go to all plant-based meats, which to me seems to be the ultimate of processed food. What is your take on that?
Good question. Yeah, I think, gosh, there's so many ends of the spectrum, and do I think as Americans, we probably eat a little bit more meat than we need to? I personally do. I think, I think our American mindset is every meal has to have a meat, and we forget about all the other foods that you can get protein from. So in my opinion, I wouldn't go as far as saying we have to eliminate all animal protein and go towards plant protein, which I totally agree with you. It ends up being a lot of processed soybean oil and corn oil, to make those burgers. But I think there is somewhere in the middle where breakfast, lunch, and dinner doesn't have to be, 6 ounces of protein. Especially as adults, we really can be just fine with a little bit less protein and get protein through avocados and nuts and seeds and vegetables even. So I would say, to answer your question, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think we all have to be completely vegan, but I do think we could cut back and not have, 4 hot dogs with our dinner, something in between.
Right. There's also increasing evidence that what we eat has a tremendous effect on our gut microbiome. And the one thing that's coming about is diversity, that the more diverse your gut microbiome is, the healthier you will tend to be. And that diversity is related linearly to the diversity of the foods that we eat. Do you talk at all to your patients with regard to the variety and diversity, the colors, the fruits and vegetables and all that stuff, to try to really push diversity?
Absolutely. Yes, and yes. I look at that as definitely kind of my phase 2 of working with a lot of my patients. Typically phase 1 is, let's get the processed foods out. And then we work on, like you said, getting diversity. I read a study that showed in order to get all the different bacteria that we need to be eating an average of 25 different kinds of vegetables, not a day, but just different kinds of vegetables. And I know oftentimes, and I get into the rut too, if you go to the grocery store and you get your broccoli and your asparagus, we just eat the same vegetables every week. I know I do. So diversity is key. And really that's where we get a lot of our good bacteria from, is vegetables. And oftentimes, like you had said, gut is just such a problem with a lot of people, IBS, and I end up having to put people on a probiotic most often just to kind of help give them that boost, because they're lacking a lot of that diversity, and there's too many bad guys versus good guys, and foods like sugar and fake sugars and alcohol and soda and antibiotics, it gets rid of all of our good bacteria. And it's almost like our gut doesn't stand a fighting chance because it needs the diversity through kale and cabbage and, you know, arugula and all of that we just don't get.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from one of the attendees. What foods are the most anti-cancer in your opinion?
Good question. Very good question. I would say cruciferous vegetables. In my opinion, those have just study after study showing amazing benefits with anti-cancer, antioxidant. They have something called DIM, D-I-M, and it's a particular compound found in vegetables that think of it like anti-cancer. I mean, they have glutathione in there, which is your king antioxidant. So cruciferous vegetables, you can look up that list on Google. Those are your king. I would say in my opinion, the most pro-cancer food would be sugar, and think, you know, sodas and Pop-Tarts and those sorts of foods. Cancer does feed on sugar, in my opinion. And so that would be the kind of opposite of anti-cancer.
Okay, thank you. Could we go back to, you had mentioned IBS, which stands for irritable bowel syndrome. Could you kind of explain to the audience the symptoms that patients have with that present to you, and then what sort of dietary recommendations you give them to help them with that?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that's a majority of my practice is patients just coming in with IBS-like symptoms, or maybe they were diagnosed with IBS by their GI doctor. And IBS is just, they're coming in with bloating and gas and diarrhea and constipation or acid reflux. It's just a whole bunch of gut symptoms, starting from the top, going all the way to the bottom, with no known real cause. So they're just kind of diagnosed with IBS, and they come to me saying, gosh, I know when I eat ice cream, I get diarrhea. Or I know when I eat pizza, I look, 9 months pregnant. What is going on? And I would say the one food that I really tend to start with elimination is wheat. Wheat being, think of like breads and pastas and your gluten. And often people say, well, gosh, isn't gluten-free diet a fad? No, not really. And we could do a whole presentation on gluten-free and what is wheat. But I find that along with dairy, but really more wheat, tends to be the food that really causes a lot of people problems when it comes to their gut. In my opinion, and based off of research I've done, gluten is a very difficult protein to digest, just because of how we've genetically modified and changed it and altered it over the years, that what our muffins that we're eating now is not the same as our great-grandmother's muffins. It's totally different. So hopefully that answers your question in a nutshell. And gosh, we could talk forever about that, because I'm very passionate about gut health, and it's a huge part of my practice.
So I'm a retired gastroenterologist, and I will absolutely echo that. Irritable bowel syndrome is probably 50% or more of the practice. We have another question here. Do you have any experience with dietary recommendations for someone with autism?
Good question. Yes, we do. This presentation would really be a perfect presentation for someone who has autism. And I do find that their symptoms can improve with not only real whole foods, but I typically add a supplement of a pretty high dose of omega-3 fatty acids, which is really good for their brain. I focus a lot on the gut as well, because there is that gut-brain connection. So this presentation would be great for anyone who knows someone with autism to really stick with whole foods, but I would add to that probably a gut healing regimen, lots of probiotics, high dose omega-3s, and yeah, I mean, I do see patients with autism frequently, and we make huge improvements just with diet changes.
Great. Let's see, here's one about dietary treatment or recommendations for someone who has asthma.
Good question. Yeah, dairy actually tends to be the #1 food that can really, believe it or not only cause asthma, but really make it worse. And I actually have gotten so many people, with the help of the physician that I work for, off their inhalers. typically we find, according to the doctor that I work with, that 80% of asthma patients, it's really just a food allergy or food sensitivity that's undiagnosed, which is pretty crazy to think. So yeah, and especially in a lot of our kiddos that we see, they come in, 6 years old and they have asthma. What, right? Well, we change their diet and they no longer have asthma. But I would say dairy does produce a lot of mucus, a lot of phlegm, and that tends to be hugely correlated with asthma.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Your thoughts about coffee?
Yeah, I have no problem with coffee, really. I mean, it's drinking 2 pots a day is not ideal, but if someone has 2 cups a day, no problem. Of course, my biggest concern is it black or you putting a ton of sugar in it? But in general, totally fine with coffee.
Great. Another question, for those who have limited resources, what foods offer the most nutrition?
Good question. I would say calorie dense foods, like healthy fats, even like butter. And I know you're probably thinking butter, but that's calorie dense that actually can get you some nutrition. I would definitely put vegetables in there too. And you can get frozen vegetables, even things like edamame, peanuts or beans that are more cost efficient, but still healthy. So hopefully that answers your question.
Right. Somebody said buy the vegetables when they're seasonal. That makes sense.
Yes.
Going back to your the beginning of your talk, when you talked about how we can identify the golden arches or the little honeybee, but not all these different foods. We're 3, 4, 5 generations removed from the farm, and several of the last generations have no idea at all where their food comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions or recommendations how young parents bringing up their kids can get them exposed to like farmers markets, or how do we get back to where we came from, so people once again learn what whole foods are? It's like you say, we just don't see it around us.
Right. Gosh, that's such a good question. And I have an almost 2-year-old, so I totally can speak to this. And I have seen firsthand that, gosh, these and I'll keep an eye on my time. I know I've got only a few minutes left, but these kids, when given goldfish, of course they love goldfish. It's tasty, right? And, if you try to give them broccoli in the next season or in the next sitting, they're going to go, oh, no, that's terrible. So I know feeding kids can be a challenge. And just through my experience, I have found a few things. Number one is get them involved in the kitchen and the meal planning thing, and get them involved. Try to have them pick out, what would you as a family like to try to pick and plan for the meal. Secondly, I think sometimes we give kids too much pressure with food. You have to finish this broccoli, and when you finish this broccoli, I'll give you dessert. So that's teaching them, all right, well, if I have just this tiny bite, then I get a bunch of sugar. Or we kind of reward our kids with sugar, right? Oh, you got a vaccine or you got a shot. Here's a lollipop to make you feel better. So I guess gosh, I could go on and on about this, but my one suggestion would be is, number one, get them involved. Number two, kind of watch the habits and lessons we're teaching them. If we're rewarding kids with dessert all the time, we're showing them, I think, a bad habit. So, and I think it starts as young as, 6 months old when you introduce the first food. It doesn't have to be wheat cereal. I gave my daughter avocado for her first food. Start young and know no matter what age your kids are, you can make changes with them, because ultimately you have the keys, you have the car, you have the money, and you're deciding what they eat. And it's going to be a battle at first, but I think it's hugely, hugely rewarded in the end. So I don't know if that answered your question. I kind of went everywhere, but it's just such an important topic. Kids and food, it's so important.
It really is. And I remember when our girls were growing up, if you have any land whatsoever, to start gardening. And I can tell you, when they grow their own carrots or they grow their own vegetables of any kind, they love them.
Mhm.
They're the one that grew it, and it really, really helps.
Totally.
We have another question here about how do you feel about fermentation or fermented vegetables?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. You can definitely get a lot of good bacteria from there, like sauerkraut. So yeah, definitely. If someone has access to that, or you can make them yourself, love them. Very hugely beneficial as far as good bacteria.
Great, great. Well, Chelsea, this has been really great. Is there any
Thank you.
thing you would like to leave for our audience? And as far as how do we've put up in the chat your email address and where they can get a hold of you if they want to. But is there anything else that you would like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I guess the one little piece of nugget I would have to say is you should and deserve to feel 100%, like $1,000,000. And if you're not, I think a great place to start is your diet and your nutrition. And don't overwhelm yourself and just start small. I promise you that will be way easier than changing everything and trying to go keto or whatever. But you deserve to feel amazing. And food often has a huge, huge impact on that.
Great. Chelsea, thanks again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Time.
Thank you so much.
So please stay tuned now for our next presenter, who will be Dr. Vivian Lowe.
Hi, I'm Elisa Isaac, a member of the Nourishing Life Planning Committee, and I'm very excited to present our next speaker, Dr. Vivian Lowe. She's coming to us from Boston, where she's the Chief Visionary and Medical Director of Transform Alliance for Health. There, she and her staff specialize in preventive care and the management of chronic metabolic disease, transforming sick care into health care. She's board certified in obesity medicine and internal medicine, and serves on the American Board of Obesity Medicine Exam Writing Board. Dr. Lowe has worked in choreography and dance, and her first novel, Breaking the Tongue, received multiple awards. She's the recipient of a Radcliffe Fellowship and a Guggenheim Fellowship in fiction. Dr. Lowe joins us today to share her expertise in metabolic health with the intention of eliminating the health gaps that plague our communities. Please post your questions for Dr. Lowe in the chat, and please remember that no personal medical questions in this forum. Welcome, Dr. Lowe.
Hello, thank you for having me. Let's see. I am going to share my screen. And voila. Okay, oops. So, today I'm talking about cardiometabolic health. And in particular, I wanted to note some of the differences that we see in ethnicities in terms of our cardiovascular functioning. I know oftentimes when we talk about health, we talk about the racial disparities, and a lot of the focus has been on policy and access to healthcare, which I totally agree needs to be addressed. However, today I thought I would talk specifically about the medical aspects of these differences, simply because I think that there needs to be a huge revision in our medical school curriculum. We need to be talking about this, spending a lot more time doing research to address these differences. And by the way, I just wanted to say happy Juneteenth. I'm honored to be presenting this today The first time I gave this talk on ethnic differences in cardiometabolic health happened to be, just by luck, MLK weekend. And then this is the second time this year that I'm presenting it, and it's Juneteenth. So I think there's a special meaning there. One last thing I want to say before I actually plunge into my presentation, and that is that, you can imagine it's a pretty daunting topic, ethnic differences in cardiometabolic health, because, then we're talking about different ethnicities across the globe, right? And then a whole vast of cardiovascular conditions. I don't think, and I don't think anyone expects me to cover everything today, but what I hope to do is to start us thinking about these differences and how if they're being addressed, especially in the medical community, because we see patients of all diverse types and ethnicities, and we need to start thinking about how we can look at each person from an individual point of view. Oops. So when I'm talking about cardiometabolic health, we're really talking about, I broke it down here, cardio referring to heart and blood vessels, and metabolic referring to the processes of energy management in your body. And when we talk about syndrome, we talk about a cluster of symptoms or diseases that run together. And when you think about cardiometabolic health, traditionally we'll be talking about heart disease and stroke, and anything that might involve, your heart and perhaps even your brain. This is a report that came out, I believe at the end of 2018, that was very startling to me, from the Gilling School of Global Public Health in North Carolina. And what they found was, based on the NHANES data from 2009 to 2016, that 88% of Americans, basically everyone, 88% of Americans have metabolic dysfunction, right? And at the time, the obesity prevalence, I just want to point out, was about 35 to 39%. So that was, from the 2009 and 2006 to 2016 data. In 2018, you'll observe that the prevalence of obesity has risen to 42%. So if, 88% of Americans, based on NHANES 2009 to 16, had metabolic dysfunction, I'll bet we're into the 90s now. And when they defined metabolic health, they were looking specifically at waist circumference, fasting glucose levels, triglycerides, which is a type of fat, you can check it from your blood, your HDL or your quote unquote good cholesterol, and also looking at your systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressures. The conclusion was basically that there was pretty bad metabolic health even in normal weight individuals. And I stress this because I often am asked to give a talk on obesity, and my favorite topic is normal weight obesity. A lot of times we walk around, we think we're in good shape, just going by a certain number, and that number often happens to be the weight. But you may have poor metabolic health even if you have normal weight. And this obviously has serious implications for public health. I think it's worse for specific ethnicities. And here we look at the CDC data from 2019 for diabetes. You see that the prevalence for non-Hispanic Blacks, the males would be 13.4%. It's pretty much almost double that of non-Hispanic white men. And we see an increase also with the women. So total, we really see more prevalence of diabetes in American Blacks. And the risk of diabetes is indeed 77% higher in African Americans than in whites. This is actually looking at Hispanic males and females. And again, you see that there is a higher percentage there with Asian Americans, same thing, 11.4% to 8% in whites. With Native Americans, actually, they have the highest diabetes rates, 16% here compared to other ethnicities. And of course, the cardiovascular risks, if we just look at the African American population, right, it would be way higher. 47% of the Black population has at least one form of cardiovascular disease, and that is compared to 36% in the white population. And really, there's a twofold greater stroke mortality and fivefold greater prevalence of end-stage renal disease in African Americans. So these numbers, you might have seen them earlier in the conference, but they are quite difficult for us to wrestle with, because this has been going on for a long time and we really haven't been addressing it. In fact, here, if we look at this paper, they make the point that a 45-year-old African-American man in the Southeast has basically the stroke risk of a 55-year-old white man. And that is also equivalent to a 65-year-old white man in the Midwest. So you can see across the board, bottom of the pyramid there would be an African-American male in terms of, in this case, hypertension. With cardiovascular deaths, 500,000 Black women die yearly from cardiovascular disease. And if we compare that to COVID numbers for 2020, that was already so sobering and painful to see. And then to realize that yearly, Black women are dying, at 500,000 of them per year. So I'm sure I'm sure we have been hearing about metabolic syndrome throughout this conference, but I just wanted to basically touch on this because we hear this a lot now in terms of cardiovascular health. What exactly is metabolic syndrome? When I'm talking to patients, I basically tell them to think of it as insulin resistance. If you're just boil it down to the basics. If you hear someone mention metabolic syndrome, you're thinking about insulin resistance. Now, what exactly does that mean? Let's take a look. We make a hormone called insulin in the pancreas, and this helps to decrease blood glucose by actually having that glucose enter into specific tissues in your body, right? So if you eat something that is, a carbohydrate or has high sugar content, that gets absorbed into your bloodstream. And what happens is with insulin, it helps facilitate this glucose entry into different tissues, such as the liver, the muscle, and the fat specifically, right? These are for at least glucose disposable, glucose transporters. This is where insulin has its effects. Insulin also has an effect on your blood vessel. And what it does is it helps dilate the blood vessel and keeps it healthy, and also helps with this nitric oxide synthase for the formation of something called nitric oxide. Just to go back quickly to insulin resistance, I found this cute little graphic and I thought it was helpful. If you think of insulin as opening the door with this key to allow glucose to enter a cell, when you have insulin resistance, then basically there is no key. The glucose doesn't enter the cell, and instead it attaches itself to, in this case, a red blood cell. All right. And when it does that, it can cause damage to the cell. It can cause damage to any of the tissues that it attaches itself to. Insulin sensitivity is actually quite different depending on your ethnicity, because, we're often used to thinking of it as just, all right, pretty much standard that, you're either insulin resistant or not. But we can see that there's a range of responses in different ethnicities. So what we're seeing here is we're looking at insulin response, right, to someone who's given some glucose. And we have the insulin levels here. And on the bottom axis, what we're seeing is how sensitive they are to that insulin, how much that insulin is really going to respond and let that glucose into the cell, right? So the high, if you're looking at the bottom axis, if you're going towards the right, then the higher the number, the more sensitive you are. And you'll see that in this case, if we start with the Caucasian population, they're somewhere here in the middle. They, respond to insulin, to glucose, to a glucose load by making a certain amount of insulin, and their sensitivity is somewhere right here in the middle of the graph. If we look at the African American population, and these, by the way, I want to stress, are people who don't have any disease. They're normal, okay? So if you look at the African American population, they start off straight away with a much higher level of insulin. In other words, they hyper respond to that dose of glucose. So that is a hyperinsulinemic response. In addition, compared to the Caucasian population, the sensitivity is lower. So they have more, another way to look at it is they have more insulin resistance, right? They're shifted to the left here. Again, in a normal population of East Asians, we see a very different story. They don't make a lot of insulin in response to that glucose load. And yet they have very high sensitivity. So way out here to the right of this curve. So, to a fixed dose of glucose, we can see different responses and different sensitivities in a normal population already. Now, once we see a pre-diabetic population, then what happens with the here, the African American population, is that you'll see a drop in their ability to make insulin now to respond to that glucose load. So in this pre-diabetic condition, we're starting to see disease, and they're now less able to respond with insulin. In addition, they have become even less sensitive to the insulin, so shifted further to the left of the curve. The East Asians are out here, and you'll see that dramatic swing, right? And this is from a normal state to pre-diabetic state, that insulin sensitivity has dropped dramatically. But in terms of the insulin response, they actually, kind of at the same level, almost a flat line there, right? With the Caucasian population shifted left in terms of sensitivity and a slight drop in the insulin levels. Now, by the time we get to flat out type 2 diabetes, then we see with the African American population that we have actually very little sensitivity here. So very insulin resistant, another way to look at it. And again, much lower insulin levels. And it's the same with, by this time, they're pretty much on par with the Caucasian population. The East Asians are, again, shifted more to the left, but look at that big drop now in insulin formation. They can't really produce much insulin at that point. One might think that they're approaching, the insulin, they're kind of looking like the type 1 diabetics at that point, right? So very interesting differences here in terms of their insulin sensitivity and response. I want to jump back to nitric oxide. And this is a molecule that is produced in different parts of your body. In this case, in the lining of your blood vessels. We call those the endothelial cells. And there is an enzyme there called nitric oxide synthase. And it will take this amino acid arginine and eventually convert it to nitric oxide. And nitric oxide has wonderful effects on your blood vessel. It will help dilate your blood vessels, right? And it inhibits stickiness of platelets and adhesions. So nice flow of blood, inhibits adhesion molecules. So again, promoting nice smooth flow and less stickiness in your blood. It can act as a neurotransmitter, and it also modulates cells in your immune system. With insulin resistance, what happens is you will have decreased nitric oxide synthase. So that means you make less of that wonderful nitric oxide. And instead you make this substance called endothelin-1, which pretty much has reverse effects. Instead of dilating those blood vessels, we're going to vasoconstrict and make those blood vessels, a lot tighter. So with African Americans, there is an impaired ability to make nitric oxide to begin with. So across the board, we see that there's a decreased endothelial ability to make this molecule. And as a result, then you don't get that nice, smooth muscle vasodilation when you have that nitric oxide forming. And this nitric oxide bioavailability is seen across the lifespan. So we're talking from the very young to the very old, just hands down throughout the lifespan, much decreased nitric oxide. And this is going to have some implications, not just in terms of insulin resistance, but also with their blood pressure, right? Because I just told you that nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator, and that will keep the blood vessels nice and open. Now, if you have much less nitric oxide, then you have more vasoconstriction, and that can lead to high blood pressure, which, if untreated, will lead to strokes, kidney disease, heart failure, and even dementia. And let's look here at the prevalence of hypertension. This was data from 2009 to 2012 from American Heart. And in non-Hispanic Blacks, and you see the breakdown male, female, prevalence is like 40, almost 45% in the males and 46% in the females. Non-Hispanic whites, 32.9%, in males, 31.1%. And then in Hispanics, 29.6 and 29.9. That was 2009 to 2012. And we look at more recent data, 2013 to 16, you see that unfortunately that prevalence has gone up, 54% hypertension prevalence in the Black population. And we see actually with the Asians also going up, and increase in the Hispanic population, whites. Across the board, we see an increase, but you can see that top of the list would be African Americans. Now, let's also look at the, reactive oxygen species, because this might be part of the mechanism that's causing some of this dysfunction, right? Any molecule that has oxygen that has an unpaired electron is called a free radical. And when you have that situation, that molecule is very unstable, very, very reactive, right? So you don't really want to have a lot of these. It doesn't just have to be oxygen species. They can be nitrogen species. They can be lipid species. But, commonly we refer to these free radicals as reactive oxygen species. So you have these molecules with the unpaired electrons out here, very reactive. And because of that instability and reactivity, they cause damage to DNA, RNA, and pretty much any tissue that they come into contact with, and they can cause cell death. As I said, they may damage lipids, proteins, DNA, RNA. They cause aging. They're involved with cognitive dysfunction or dementia, male infertility, cancer. So all pretty bad stuff, right? And when we talk about oxidative stress, and we'll come back to this a few times, we talk about oxidative stress. What we're really talking about is this balance between the formation of these free radicals and antioxidant activity in your body, right? So antioxidant is reversing the formation, the damage caused by these reactive species. So when you think about oxidative stress, again, think of this balance. And when we talk about increased oxidative stress, we're basically saying the balance is off. And you're making a lot more of these unstable molecules, the reactive molecules that will cause tissue damage. Now we have these transmembrane enzymes, NADPH oxidases, I call them NOx here. They are key ROS producers. They form a lot of free radicals. And we see that they actually happen to be elevated in African Americans. So we're causing a lot more of this oxidative stress and more damage to tissue. In addition, we see that this molecule, xanthine oxidase, right, is an enzyme that's involved in the formation of uric acid, which is also implicated in metabolic syndrome. And we form a lot more of these free radicals when we have this enzyme active. Okay, I want you to keep these two enzymes in mind, the NOx and the xanthine oxidase, because when we look at the next graph, you'll see why. So I'll walk you through this. What we're looking at on the y-axis is cardiovascular conductance, and what that means is how easily blood is flowing through the bed of blood vessels. Okay, and if you have high conductance, then it's flowing well and easily. If you have low conductance, then there's resistance. It's really hard for that blood to flow through. So in this case, you see that the bars in black are controls. The bars in white are people who are given this chemical, aposinin, and this is a NOx inhibitor. In other words, it's preventing that NOx enzyme and therefore preventing those free radicals. And in the striped bars, they're given allopurinol, which inhibits that xanthine oxidase, another free radical producer, right? So these are two different chemicals that are given to these subjects, but essentially to decrease these free radicals, right? And in the white population, you notice here's the conductance, this is how easily blood flows through a bed of blood vessels in that population. When you give the inhibitors that will actually decrease the free radical formation, you don't see much difference. You can see that they're pretty much equal here. The blood is still flowing as it was before. If you look at a population of Blacks, then we know, first of all, that even in the control state, we have lower conductance. So there's already more resistance in blood flow just to start off with. However, when you give those chemicals that will inhibit the free radical formation, you see that the flow increases, right? In this case, with aposinin, the NOx inhibitor, this is the xanthine oxidase inhibitor. And once you give that and you inhibit free radical formation, you see that we increase blood flow in this Black population. This graph, you know, what they have done is they've given everyone on both sides, right? Everyone was given a chemical that actually inhibits nitric oxide synthase. So this chemical prevents formation of nitric oxide, or decreases greatly the formation of nitric oxide in your blood vessel. So from the start, they give you that. And you see now, even in the controls, there's less blood flow because there's less nitric oxide. All right. And then if you give those free radical chemicals, inhibitors in the white population, again, not much change. So much lower blood flow, especially compared to this, right? Now we have nitric oxide synthase inhibitor. We're not making a lot of nitric oxide, and we have not a lot of blood flow. But when you inhibit the free radical formation, you see that we do get an increase, meaning that they somehow are under more oxidative stress just to begin with. And then we do see differences between Black men and Black women even. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, so I'm gonna just skip those graphs and basically come down to the baseline is there might be more oxidative stress seen in Black men, and but we might also have more of this endothelin 1 formation, which causes vasoconstriction in Black women. So not only are there ethnic differences, there are also gender differences within ethnicities that we have to pay attention to. All right, another sort of metabolic disease that we should be looking at is obesity. This is NHANES data from very recent 2017 to 2018, right? And you'll see the legend here, the dark blue non-Hispanic white, and then this lighter blue non-Hispanic Black, the darker green non-Hispanic Asian, and then Hispanic in the lighter green. And you'll already see right here total in terms of obesity for Blacks is about almost 50%. And these graphs are just telling you the same thing. I'll go through them quickly. One thing I want to stress is that we often think of obesity as just weight alone. And I want to point out that there are some nuances here that we have to pay attention to. When I think of obesity, I think in terms of obviously fat mass, so the amount of fat, but I also think about dysfunctional fat. In other words, okay, given this amount of fat, how much of the fat is functional and how much of it is dysfunctional? I also want to know the fat distribution, because where it is, that compartmentalization of fat will tell me a lot about its function and whether it is causing inflammation or not. So, you know, the differences here, while we do see differences in obesity prevalence in ethnicities, I want to point out that a lot of this data looks primarily at the BMI, which is just your weight over height squared in metric units, right? And it's not taking into account your body composition. So I don't feel is as useful because we're missing quite a big piece of the picture. We just get the mass part. We don't get the function part, and we don't get the distribution part. We're really not getting the body composition. So there needs to be a lot more work done, not just in obesity, but looking at body composition across different ethnicities. Now, very quickly on to vitamin D. Like I said, I'm trying to give you just kind of a broad sweep of some of the categories we can look at in terms of these ethnic differences. With vitamin D, we know that it's quite well documented that it's related to many cardiovascular complications if there is deficiency in vitamin D. And I want to remind people that it is considered a pro-hormone. We have to get it from an outside source if we don't make enough in our skin. And then it has its effects throughout the body. And this slide is just to show that the VDR is a vitamin D receptor, right? Which is, first of all, present in all cells of your body. So just think about that. If you have vitamin deficiency, then that's going to impact every cell in your body, because every cell in your body has vitamin D receptors. And by the way, these are intracellular receptors, which means they're not on the surface of the cell, they are inside the cell. And what's special about intracellular receptors is that they often will be involved with gene transcription. So when vitamin D binds, it will, with the receptor inside the cell, it can impact gene transcription in the nucleus. And that's why it's so powerful. If we look at vitamin D in African Americans, we note that most young, healthy Blacks do not achieve optimal levels at any time of the year. Any time of the year. I know we're going into summer, it's the solstice, but no, we're not going to be getting enough even over the summer. And even in Africa, right, I made a point to put this in the slide that vitamin D deficiency is high. If we look at Native Americans, 2/3 of Native Americans are deficient, and almost 1/3 has severe deficiency. With Hispanic Americans, almost 30% are D deficient, and half of Asian Americans are D deficient. As I mentioned, a lot of people point out to me that this time of the year, they're going out and getting their vitamin D in the sun. But that's not so easy. If you live where I live, I'm in the Boston area, and that's above 32, anywhere above 32, 35 degrees north or south, you're going to have trouble getting enough of these UVBs that are necessary for that vitamin D formation in your skin. So because of the angle at which the sun, is at different times of the year, right, then you have more or less UVB exposure, again, depending on time of year. In the summer here in Boston, yeah, we would have a bit more. And if I wanted to get my vitamin D from the sun, I need to be outside around between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. because that's when I will get enough UVB. And then I would have to pretty much be in my bathing suit, right? Expose large areas back. Most of the time, if you go out, you're on your lunch break, you have your arms exposed maybe, and you're sitting in the sun and you may enjoy that warmth, but you really don't have enough surface area to be making much vitamin D. All right, next would be sleep, keeping an eye on the time. This is something that we don't think about very often, but sleep duration is linked to cardiovascular disease. We know that if you're not sleeping enough or you have poor quality sleep, you're much more likely to be obese, you're much more likely to be diabetic, and you're much more likely to have neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. In this case, I want to focus on one aspect of sleep called nocturnal dipping. Right, when you get to, let's say, deep sleep, you should have a drop in your heart rate and you should have the lowest blood pressure of the day. So this is called nocturnal blood pressure dipping. So the blood pressure drops, and that's a good sign when you're in deep sleep. What we've noted is that African Americans have higher nocturnal blood pressures. So they're not getting that nice dip of blood pressure in deep sleep. And we see this by age 10, and there's already this blunted dipper response in the adolescents, okay? I think what is really fascinating to me is that this is not observed in people of African heritage outside the US. And this is primarily seen in African Americans, this lack of nocturnal dipping. And we can talk about, maybe in the question and answer session, we can speculate on some of the reasons, but I just thought this was a fascinating point here. When you have that absence of that dipping, you are at increased risk of enlargement of the heart, that's cardiac hypertrophy, silent strokes, and you may be leaking protein in your urine, which is a sign of kidney dysfunction. So it's not a good thing. And in fact, every 5% lessening of that dipping confers a 20% increase in risk of cardiovascular mortality. And that is quite sobering, right? So if you lose that dipping, it can have a huge impact on your cardiovascular mortality. And, we can speculate, but we see that African Americans are 2 times as likely to have non-dipping blood profiles, and they have more sleep disturbances. So shorter sleep, more fragmented sleep, less of the slow wave sleep, and more obstructive sleep apnea. So briefly, what are some of the lifestyle recommendations that I would make to counter some of these differences? Obviously, we want to be avoiding any poor nutrition. So processed foods are out. I don't think I have to say that to this audience. As much as possible, my belief is to eat foods of one ingredient. So, broccoli, chicken, one ingredients. Avoid toxins such as smoking and alcohol. Many people don't realize this, but alcohol is a class 1 carcinogen. Other class 1 carcinogens are tobacco and asbestos. So, we would do well to definitely avoid those kinds of environmental toxins. The chronic stress here can have an impact because chronic stress will raise your oxidative stress. And you remember, we would have then an imbalance, more free radical formation, right? So decreasing chronic stress can be very helpful in decreasing general oxidative stress. And obviously, we want to avoid infections if we can. We can't always do that. We want to avoid physical inactivity. So the more active we are, the more helpful in terms of keeping our blood vessels healthy, in terms of decreasing our risk for insulin resistance and preserving that metabolic health. And of course, we want to address any vitamin D deficiencies, make sure that we get enough supplementation. In this case, depending on where you live, it will be very hard. I grew up in the equatorial tropics, and you would think that we would get a lot of vitamin D, but then most people avoided the sun like the plague because it was just way too hot. So, in the end, we all needed our vitamin D supplementation anyway. And then avoid circadian disruption, which is to say, really address your sleep. In terms of addressing that oxidative stress, we could ingest more antioxidants. So this is vitamin C, which is a well-known antioxidant. This is a study that basically showed that it's looking at the levels of vitamin C in your blood and then comparing it with your blood pressure, systolic blood pressure. And as you go across the quartiles here, in quartile 4 would be the highest vitamin C content, and here would be the lowest. Quartile 1 would be the lowest vitamin C content. And basically, the more vitamin C, right, the lower the blood pressure. And this is another study showing that. In this one, it's an old study, but they were able to, with vitamin C supplementation, drop the systolic blood pressure by as much as 10 millimeters of mercury, which is quite a lot, right? And these are other, sort of effects that we've seen. If you give vitamin C, you can facilitate more of that vasodilation and help decrease that blood pressure. And by the way, about 40% of Americans are below this estimated average requirement for vitamin C, 40%. I have seen flat out scurvy in my population of patients. It's not that uncommon. Nitrate intake is really important, and the best source of nitrates would be these nice green leafy vegetables, especially important because what happens is these nitrates then can eventually be converted to nitric oxide, which is going to help your vasodilation. Now, one point I want to bring across here, which I found pretty interesting, and this seems to be quite well known amongst the dentists, but when I ask other doctors, they're not quite aware of it, that if you use any over-the-counter mouthwash with alcohol or any antibacterial, then you're going to increase your blood pressure because you're going to decrease nitric oxide formation. So essentially, back to the gut microbiome, we often think of lower gut. We don't often think of the upper gut, which is in the mouth, but we have these bacteria in the mouth. And when we eat the nitrates via the green leafy vegetables, they can convert the nitrates to nitrites, which then can get absorbed, and then they're carried around in the blood, and eventually they will be converted to nitric oxide, right? If we kill those bacteria with mouthwash, with antibacterial sort of, either toothpaste or other antibacterial oral agents, then we kill those bacteria and then we lose this effect. And that can have a big effect on your blood pressure, quite noticeable. And if you are in a population that already has blunted nitric oxide production, as in African Americans, then we really need to make sure that we prioritize the flora, the mouth flora. There's another study showing that, pretty well known. I think I will end here and see if you have any questions.
We do have some questions. Cynthia asks if you could please say more about dysfunctional fat, maybe lipodystrophy, and how this plays into metabolic syndrome and how one can manage it.
So lipodystrophy is quite different. It's the lack of fat, but we're so used to thinking putting fat in the villain box, right? But we do need fat, and it's really important that we have healthy fat. We have two main compartments where we see fat. One is the subcutaneous, which is under the skin. And then we have this whole other category called ectopic fat. And ectopic just means it's not where it should be. And one subset of ectopic fat is what we call the visceral fat. And this is fat inside the abdominal cavity. But other ectopic fat may be fat that are in your organs, such as in your liver, in your heart, in your pancreas, just name the organ, you could have fat there. I saw a question earlier about asthma. And what people don't realize is that we do have fat, ectopic fat, in the airways, in the lungs. And when you get rid of that ectopic fat, then actually the asthma symptoms go away. And most pulmonologists will want that fat to be gone, right? So with regards to the fat, the ectopic fat, it is highly inflammatory. It secretes all kinds of inflammatory cytokines, and it promotes the formation of cancers. 40% of cancers globally are associated with this very toxic fat. So, you know, it's a nuance about fat distribution that people don't often talk about or consider, but I think it's highly important. Now, subcutaneous fat eventually can also become dysfunctional, but by and large, it is almost acting like a reservoir and a protective sink, right? Because if it goes inside, you know, into the viscera, for example, and into organs, then we're really in trouble.
Okay. Marjorie asks, the study that showed the correlation between vitamin C intake and a reduction in hypertension, was that vitamin C from whole foods or was it from a supplement?
Supplement they infused, okay? So if you remember the 4 quartiles, you know, and I showed that if you had higher dose, you had less, your systolic blood pressure was lower, right? Now the first quartile, which was the lowest you know, content of vitamin C, I believe was 0.5 milligrams, which is equivalent to 1 orange. Yeah, not a lot. That's right. So unless you have an orange grove and you're ready to like just spend your whole day consuming oranges, probably not the way to go. We do not make vitamin C, so we have to ingest it, right? Most animals do. Most animals make vitamin C. We are like guinea pigs and some other primates, and we do not, we have all the enzymes except the last one. So we don't make that vitamin C. And so we have to get it from either food sources or supplementation. Now, in the case of where they actually infuse, I believe they went to 1 gram a day. And I think the higher doses were more towards 1 to 2 grams a day. So remember, grams, okay? So versus milligrams. So 1 gram would be 1,000 milligrams. And that's really hard to get from foods daily.
Dr. Lowe, you said something about we might get into in this period. Some of these things you see differences in African Americans versus people who live in Africa. Right. The nocturnal dipping, for example. And I thought I would ask you about that, if you would talk more about that. And I was thinking about the insulin resistance versus insulin sensitivity. Was that maybe something that is different?
So that is across people, across the board for people of African heritage. So you do see that in Africans from Africa, Africans in the Caribbean, for example, right? But with the nocturnal dipping, that is specific. So if you had Africans who are living in England, for example, you don't see that, right? So I do think my own speculation, because I don't know for sure, I haven't seen any studies to try to pinpoint the reason. My speculation is that this is an indication of increased oxidative stress, probably from increased chronic stress. And that suggests to me an environmental exposure. And that could be, you know, in terms of pollution and nutrition, but it could also be in terms of our social systems.
Systemic racism.
Yes.
And trauma.
Yes.
Rachel asks, do you think the unique trauma that African Americans have experienced in the US and getting here is part of the cause of some of these predispositions?
I personally think so. And it's not just trauma, it is unrelenting, right?
Right. It's not just
the
past.
continuation of, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I'm glad someone asked.
Yes. We have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Lowe, I have to, when I look at your website, I have to think that there's a spiritual component there when you're the chief visionary of your practice. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, a lot of what we do is basically help people change their lifestyles, and you can't do that without addressing the whole person, right? We have a whole team approach, and I can't say it's me, but I have a wonderful team, and they're here to help our patients in terms of lifestyle and behavior change. And once we talk about lifestyle and behavior change, we are also talking about changing our interactions and relationships in the broader world, right? If you note that Gilling's study, 88% of Americans have metabolic dysfunction. So as we treat our patients and reverse that metabolic dysfunction and bring them into the 12%, I tell my patients, by definition, you are abnormal. You are outside the norm. And this is going to be hard. And it certainly is in terms of the pressures around foods, pressures around certain behaviors, right? So, we see that if we don't address the whole person, all aspects, then we're not really going to help them have meaningful change.
Dr. Cucuzella has chatted that in his practice, they ask about trauma at every visit, because if it's not addressed, you can't help people. And then I suppose there is, the trauma of history that we can all learn about before we even, we can learn our history, and that might help.
Yeah, there's absolutely that.
Dr. Lowe, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how your humanities side, the writing, the choreography, the dancing, how does that inform your practice as a physician?
I think it's invaluable because, for example, I do use narrative writing with my patients. I do use movement a lot with my patients. So, I have a whole lecture on movement and cognition. So I utilize the movement and to help people with neuroplasticity, for example, and also for dealing with stress. So all those components, dance and writing and connecting with our own humanity, really, I think, helps ground the patient, helps ground me in my practice. But I also find them to be really useful tools, very practical tools in helping address some of these issues.
And so you're still writing for yourself?
Currently working on a nonfiction book. I have a fiction novel that's shelved, but some people have kind of been trying to persuade me to revive it, and I might at that time, but I really would like to finish my nonfiction book first. And that does involve metabolic dysfunction.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, we can all look forward to hearing about that and hearing that come out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And I want to remind everyone, Dr. Lowe will be rejoining us at 4 for a panel discussion with Dr. Mark Cucuzella and also with Jim Linney. And we're going to be taking a brief break now. Please rejoin us at 3:15 Eastern Time when we'll hear from Dr. Mark Cucuzella. Thank you, Dr. Lowe.
Peggy, this is Mark. Can you hear?
Yes,
Okay, good.
I
Do you
did.
want me to just try to share my screen quickly, just to see if this works? Good.
Yeah, I can tell you if it works or not.
Okay,
Rachel's
let me
the
do
expert
share
one.
screen. This will stop other sharing screen. Do you want to continue? Let me just for a brief second, just to make sure like I come across okay.
Although Rachel's probably gonna.
So I would hit like this. Okay, okay, cool. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll hit stop share. Yeah, so we're good.
All right. Okay. I
Yeah,
did not
I've-
realize
yeah.
we could private chat over Zoom. You surprised me.
Well, I had to find, I'm on vacation and
Oh,
the place that we're staying at said it had Wi-Fi, but the Wi-Fi didn't work. So luckily I found a place that had a little office that they're kind and they're letting me use the office. So I'm in Canaan Valley, which is nice.
oh, Canaan Valley. Okay,
Yeah,
we've been there.
yeah, it's a wonderful place.
Was born in Morgantown. My parents raised
Okay.
us as West Virginians.
Yeah, so you know Canaan Valley.
Yes, we actually drove to Canaan Valley the wrong way. And I mean, we went through on some very, very narrow, rough roads in the dark. We saw bears. we uh, we had to, one turn was such a sharp turn, we had to back the car up and give it another go. So yes, we distinctly remember Canaan Valley, but we had a wonderful time once we got there.
Oh, cool. Yeah, this will be a nice little, I'm glad I was able to hop on for most of Vivian's because it kind of tags right into her stuff.
Good, good.
Yeah. And I
Great.
won't duplicate. It was good I heard, so I won't duplicate things that she talked about.
You know,
You were really helpful in the chat, Dr. Kukazela. Thank you. Excuse me.
No problem. She was spot on. Yeah, she talked about things that aren't the common things people talk about.
she is sharp.
Yeah.
She is just,
Now I can make, you could tell the participants, I can make a handout of these slides and send it to you later, if that helps. Because you kind of fly through slides and people, oh, I want to see that again.
okay, Rachel is reminding us that this is on TV right now. Okay, so maybe we should pause until things start.
Sounds good.
Okay. Start video. Hello, I'm Peggy Nestor. I'm also a conference planning committee member, and I'm so happy this afternoon to introduce Dr. Mark Cucuzzella and grateful to have him join us today from his home in beautiful West Virginia. Dr. Cucuzzella is board certified in family medicine. He's assistant professor of medicine at West Virginia University. He's a retired Air Force Reserve lieutenant colonel, an avid runner and advocate for getting out in nature. Type 2 diabetes, it's epidemic around the globe. It affects nearly 500 million people now, growing rapidly. It has long been accepted that it is a chronic, progressive, and incurable disease. This afternoon, Dr. Cucuzzella will present the latest science and research in his talk titled Type 2 Diabetes Remission, Fact or Fiction. We will defer questions until the panel, which will follow immediately after his talk. So please welcome Dr. Mark Cucuzzella.
Mark, you're still muted.
Okay, now I will share. You think we would have all done enough Zoom meetings that I would unmute? Okay. Okay, I think we're good now. So certainly it's a privilege, Alyssa and Peggy, to be presenting here to your group. I'm sitting here in Canaan Valley, West Virginia, and it's a beautiful place, not actually too far from where you are in Yellow Springs, which is one of my favorite places in Ohio. Spent many years of my reserve career at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and being a lover of trails, there's some of the most amazing trails in Yellow Springs. So maybe one day if we do a live conference, it's like a little earthy enclave, near, $1 billion Air Force base. So I would love, getting, driving 20 minutes away when I was on the base and be able to get some coffee and a run in Yellow Springs. But yes, what I'm going to talk about today is diabetes remission. Is this a real thing? When I started medical school 30 years ago, diabetes was this chronic condition, and we didn't even think that it could go away. But I think now, with experience of patients and the science finally catching up with the experience of patients, science travels late in the game when patients are making change. We're now accepting that this should be a standard of care. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the science, a little bit of the practical too, and even if we have some time, I have about 30 different case studies on this of patients I see. Maybe we could choose one or two of them, or even talk about that a little bit in the chat. But I want to keep this pretty informal. So if you have a question, you could throw it in the chat, and then we could catch it later, as we do the session from 4 to 5. And I really appreciate Vivian. So I'm going to kind of briefly kind of cruise over things she covered, because Vivian and I know Vivian just through the internet and sharing emails, that we're very aligned in what we're trying to do to give patients hope and restore their health, not just manage their disease. So I really thank Vivian, with her presentation. So next slide here, objectives, so understand some of the key features of what's the insulin resistance metabolic syndrome. How can we reverse this? A little bit on the science of low carbohydrate diets, and we can touch on this because I think it's important. I just got a textbook chapter and a paper accepted on medication reduction, with low carbohydrate diets, because we learn in medical school thousands and thousands of hours on how to prescribe medications, but I don't think I had a single talk on how to deprescribe medications in all of my training. So I hope in the future that taking medicines away will be just as prevalent as adding more medications. Disclosures, I don't have anything really to disclose other than I own a small running shoe store in West Virginia that opened to really support a nonprofit where we're building trails for kids in schools. And I'm a director of what's called the Low Carb Action Network and a founding member of the Nutrition Coalition. And these are advocacy groups where our primary purpose is revising the dietary guidelines for America. I also work as a science advisor for Diet Doctor, which is a wonderful site with no commercial interests. We all believe in physical activity, and I love physical activity. And I was the medical director of a conference called the Southern Obesity Summit, 18 states, all in that stroke belt, obesity belt, cardiovascular disease belt, pretty much poverty belt. You name the condition and it all travels, in the Southeast. There's this whole belt from West Virginia down to Mississippi. And I kind of just snapped this picture. I thought it was kind of humorous. We're at this obesity conference and everyone's taking the escalator down. And this is what you see at airports too, right? No one takes the stairs. Everyone just, after you've been sitting on a plane for 5 hours. So maybe next time you're looking at this, you'll think twice about getting on the escalator. So I'm here today, and if you're a patient or someone practicing medicine in any scope, whether you're a health coach or dietitian or, nurse, we're here to bring people hope. Diabetes has traditionally been thought of as one of the diseases of despair. I mean, it's like, how do you get out of this? And it's just more tests, more drugs, more complications. But we're here to give people hope. This was one of my patients last week. If people actually understand this and get support, it's crazy what health benefits they can get. This is about 7 months on a reduced carbohydrate diet, focusing on healthy foods, 70 pounds gone, almost all of his medications. Able to throw away his CPAP. Basically, it liberates you and sets you free. You become a well person again. And maybe one day this wonderful gentleman who just retired, will die of natural causes. We don't see that anymore, dying of nothing, meaning you're a well person and you just vigorous up until the very end and you go to sleep and you don't wake up. But now that's pretty rare. We all die of something, and it's one of the conditions associated with insulin resistance. Pre-diabetes, I think, is just dismissed from what I see in my medical practice. It's just pre-diabetes, I'm borderline. Patients do not understand this, but the more pre-diabetic you are, the more diabetic you are. It's like a skateboard ramp, your cardiovascular risk. And it's a human right to understand this, because if you don't understand this and you don't understand it's actionable, and we're treating you as healthcare providers, it's similar that if, think about this, 25 years ago, there's the beginnings to be a cure for AIDS. We had powerful medications that could put, and giving out condoms, things that just prevented and treated AIDS. And what if people just didn't know about that? Now you think that's crazy, but it's similar, I think, with pre-diabetes and diabetes. There's such simple preventive and treatments, meaning most of the treatment is lifestyle, that makes this go away and makes it not happen to begin with. If you want to really look at how powerful this diabetes is to cardiovascular risk, this is the Women's Health Study. This was published a couple months ago, 21 years, 28,000 women. So what drives cardiovascular disease? So we all know if you got a little bit in your genes, your mother, your father had cardiovascular disease. This is kind of odds. So 1.5 odds, 50% increased risk if you have a first degree relative cardiovascular disease. And sometimes that's just because people in the same families might live the same, eat the same, exercise the same, or not exercise the same. Smoking, 4 times risk. That's legit, right? And every patient we see who's smoking, of course, we would tell them, to quit smoking if you want to decrease your cardiovascular odds. But look at this stuff, kind of going up the chain here. We got obesity, hypertension, and then this thing, Vivian mentioned the metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance, 6 times cardiovascular risk. This is worse than smoking. And certainly if you have full diabetes, 11 times risk. So if you're walking around and you have type 2 diabetes and you're not aware that you have an 11 times cardiovascular risk, and we haven't told you, that's on us. We need to tell these folks. And look at the labs, right? So there's a lab study where you can actually measure through multiple lipid markers what your insulin resistance is. 6 times risk. LDL barely moves the bar, as far as your risk. And if you look at LDL, it's the small LDLs, not the large LDLs. So these small LDLs and total LDL travel with insulin resistance. The large LDLs are really a marker of health. So if we're focusing here on cholesterol, but not here, we're wrong. We have to rethink this and relearn it. Vivian touched on this: body mass index, fasting, insulin, systemic inflammation. They all travel together, so we should be looking a little more at insulin. And, Vivian mentioned the different ethnicities have different responses of this hyperinsulinemic or non-hyperinsulinemic response to the resistance, which may affect when they become diabetic. So a lot to learn in this space. No one's testing insulin. But let's talk a little bit about epidemics and pandemics. So, I think the word pandemic right now is we're kind of done with hearing about that. But diabetes, and maybe it'll, the coronavirus pandemic will ultimately fade away. But no kidding, type 2 diabetes is not going away. This is a global pandemic. So kind of going down, Vivian showed the slide too, the prevalence of obesity now in America, this is the NHANES data, but what terrifies me, this doesn't break it out by ethnicity, this is total, is this group here, the 20-year-olds. So when people are entering young adulthood already obese, their odds of becoming a normal weight adult is near zero right now. So we're failing our children. We should, as a society, deliver kids into the world healthy. So they're developing these conditions in grade school now, and it is not the children's fault. You cannot blame an 8-year-old who's drinking chocolate milk at school, on that they're becoming obese because they just need more gym class. We know the metabolic drivers of obesity and the massive amounts of processed food and sugars that these kids get, in the guidance of the US dietary guidelines is just, it's not acceptable. Around the world. So obesity is not just an American problem. It's even in developing countries. You have malnutrition and obesity in the same countries because the cheapest foods are the processed carbohydrates with added vegetable oils. They're the cheap foods. The cheap oils and the cheap flours and the added sugar. And those are foods of food stamps and poverty, and that drives obesity, and they're not nutrient dense. So there's no nutrients in these foods. So they're malnourished and obese at the same time. Pick any part of the world, and obesity is just going up like a skateboard ramp. So projections are horrible because, everyone is aware now that obesity is a big deal, but, the numbers keep going up. So 2030, half of the US will be obese. How do we bend this curve? We can do nothing. We could do little minor strategies, but it won't happen. So, this is a slide in relation to early coronavirus. You got to put the hammer down if you're going to blunt this. So, I wrote this in April of last year as a time to quarantine junk food, because we knew right away with coronavirus, the only people that hit our hospitals, and I was working in our hospital, were the people with comorbidities, and that includes children too. Marty McCary was on, he's at Hopkins, Doc's written multiple books, but he and his research team documented that there's not been a healthy child die of coronavirus. That's fascinating to think about. So if you're healthy, your odds of dying of coronavirus are near zero. We wouldn't have this going on if we had a healthy society. And if we had acted early in April of last year and, put some resources into preventing diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, these are, every paper you read on coronavirus, these are the ones that put you in the hospital. We'd be looking at a different scenario now. And this is going to come around again. And Nina Teicholz and I wrote an article. Nina Teicholz is the author of The Big Fat Surprise. And it took us 10 months to get this article published. Is it time for a lockdown on sugar? And I can share that article with you later with the mechanisms of what happens in obesity and diabetes, that lead and drive to the cytokine storm and the faulty immune response. Why do people get sick? Even diaphragmatic function, if you've got a lot of visceral adipose tissue, so many drivers. So I'm a family doc, and I think, one of the beauties of being a generalist is, someone told me this when I was in my training, where the experts disagree, the ignorant are free to choose. So maybe a generalist, if you're a generalist out there, a holistic health practitioner, you could line up all the expert opinions. They all disagree. So yours is probably just as valuable, and have that beginner's mind. This is a really good book. It's called Think Again. It's by Adam Grant. He's a organizational psychologist, but he does his research really into, how the mind and intellect is working to shape behavior. But one thing I witnessed, I'm a professor at a medical school, been through the whole trail of everything in the academic, writing and promotions and, discussions and, all that stuff. But what we don't see is what's called intellectual humility. And I think that's where all of us here, I hope you'll leave this with some intellectual humility. I mean, there's a lot we need to know. and myself as a family doc, quite often in an academic environment, we'll get bullied by the subspecialist because, oh, you're just a family doc, right? You're not a cardiologist, endocrinologist, you don't really have, the right to be sharing this stuff. And, I'll back it up with, hundreds of papers that we can share, and we can have a nice intellectual discussion versus dismissal. So this today is a nice intellectual discussion because Vivi and I do not have all the answers. We're just observing things, reading things, researching things, trying to discover new things because, this is a pandemic which we have not flattened the curve. And I think you'll see this in really the practice of anything. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and there's a lot of folks out there, probably, with really good heart, get a little bit of knowledge about a topic, and then they have high confidence to give advice. And you'll see this kind of with young medical trainees. Maybe someone says saturated fat is bad, and their patients are fully diabetic, and they'll tell them to have a lot of whole grains, and maybe that works for a certain subset of people, but they don't fully understand that probably is not going to work for a diabetic patient. But they'll freely give that advice across the board, with good intention. And then, kind of the longer you go, you're like, oh, wow, there's a lot I need to know about this. And it's complicated. This has been about a 10-year journey for myself, digging into nutrition and disease remission and low carb plans for diabetes and obesity. And I'll share with you later a little bit how I got into this space. But, if you're in an environment, an academic environment, you see this happen. People fall into different camps and how they think. You have, a preacher mode, someone just defending a sacred value. And you see this with the lipid hypothesis, cholesterol causes heart disease. If you've spent your whole life advocating that high cholesterol causes heart disease, and if I lower your cholesterol, I'm going to reduce your odds and don't bother me with anything else, you're really defending that value. Not open to discussion. Prosecutor is when you just basically want to silence people who have an opposing position, as if you're trying to win an argument. Politician mode, you see this a lot with young learners, if they're rotating with a senior doctor, so they'll just ally with the camp of whatever that senior doctor's way of practice is, because really they're just trying to kind of work their way through the system with the least resistance as possible. Then you got a scientific mode where we're always searching for the truth. So this is, I hope, where you all will be after this discussion. People will say this low carb way of eating for diabetes remission is an extreme diet. So this is kind of a little bit of the stuff I would eat. You can pause there. Does this look extreme or does this look highly nourishing? I would hope most of you, if you're hungry right now, or be like trying to pick which of those you would want to eat. So yeah, no, this is not extreme. This is what we eat. Now, I've given talks all over the place on this topic. This was at a military conference a couple years ago, giving a talk on low carb diets for soldiers who are trying to lose weight, because they have to, military members need to maintain a waist standard and a weight standard, as well as a fitness standard. And this is what they had for breakfast, and there wasn't a single thing out there that I would eat. And certainly if you had a problem with your fitness test and obesity, I would hope that you wouldn't eat any of these things either. But this is acceptable food at medical conferences. I actually this was a grand rounds presentation, as well as for CDEs at a local hospital. And this is obviously sponsored by the drug companies, but they're, again, like a diabetes talk. This is what it's like, basically feeding us diabetes as we're giving the talk on diabetes. If you go into a hospital, and your doctor orders what's called a cardiac diet, say you had some chest pain. So the cardiac diet in a hospital won't have any fat in it. Now, no kidding, you just saw that diabetes is the biggest driver of cardiovascular disease. This has 200 grams of carbohydrates. Now, does this look good for your heart if you're in there with unstable chest pain? I would hope your answer would be no. If you are in a hospital and they just type in an ADA diet, for diabetes at 60 grams of carbohydrates, this is what you'll get. And if any of you, I've got a glucose monitor on my arm now, this would blow up my glucometer in a tenth of this plate. We've done some change, so be willing to, have, be the resistance, right? So, yeah, so we got sugar drinks out of my hospital for patients, visitors, and staff. We actually got implemented in 2000 13 low carb menus for diabetes patients, so you can do a 10-gram carb per meal. And do these look like restrictive diets? People say, oh, that's really restrictive. Does this look restrictive, or does this look like a healthy meal? I would hope you'd say that looks pretty good, right? It's a healthy meal, and our dietitian made up a 7-day menu. This is what you would get. So this is not complicated to do. But again, you're fighting institutional entrenchment and dogma if you go into a big hospital system and want to suggest that they get rid of this, which is the reason that person is in the hospital, and feed them this, which eggs, eggs do not cause heart disease. And I think, if anyone wants references to that, they could just put it into their PubMed search. That's been debunked. Even the US government in 2015 in the dietary guidelines said fat and cholesterol are no longer nutrients of concern, meaning that cholesterol in the egg is not raising your blood cholesterol, and your blood cholesterol doesn't clog your arteries. It's not that simple. So not many people would actually be able to finish that meal right there, especially if they're, in a hospital getting treated for an illness. We have free drink options in our hospital, when we implemented this, just so the natives wouldn't get too restless that we took their soda away. We, have just like a hotel lobby. And we did this 4 years ago, and there's people are pretty proud of it, got rid of all these vending machines. We actually opened a clinic. I think some of the changes we were making in the hospital led to some innovation. So we opened a clinic where I'm actually allowed to prescribe eggs to people, at a university. This was a patient who put his diabetes in remission, pretty simple thinker, he's on, uses SNAP for his food costs, doesn't have a kitchen really, and can figure this out, so, this is my state right here, it's West Virginia. We're outliers and being most of the time either number 1 or number 2 in the obesity and diabetes. It's one of the most recent data from NHANES. We've got number 1 in diabetes. There's a lot of unique things to Appalachia too, and despair and poverty, and but that's another whole talk. Vivian mentioned this, so it's actually really rare to be well now. Only 12% of the population now is well, but you guys saw that with her presentation. Now the military, I spent 29 years in the military before I retired, but obesity is huge amongst active duty folks. So the Army, 69% overweight or obese. Marines have the lowest. It's 60% plus across the board. And as people get more senior in their career, certainly the BMI is not defining healthy or unhealthy obese. There are some younger military soldiers who certainly have high BMIs who I want to go downrange with, super strong, muscular body types. But as people go later in their career, they tend to look like the rest of the society around them. And so that overweight and obesity is not muscle. They're putting it on in the middle, in the belly. I'm on a couple working groups now, that are trying to, how do you make inroads into a military culture and what is served in chow halls. This is another article which also, defining this over fat and under fat goes to what Vivian was talking about. So we need to define who is over fat in the wrong place, not overweight, because if you're over fat in the belly, that visceral adipose tissue and that ectopic fat, that starts to occur as people develop that visceral, that apple shape, that is the disease. And that's what we want to rid and prevent. So a little bit about how I got into this space, as a marathon runner, if you went and looked at me, you'd be like, okay, this person should not have these conditions. But I was 45 years old, on military duty at Wright Pat, and I had a high fasting glucose. People my age don't go to docs, but men especially, men do not go to doctors unless they're kind of forced to by, military standards. They have to do this every year, or employment physical, but men especially just don't go to docs unless they have a symptom. But my glucose was up in the 140s and my A1C was above 6. And it just seemed a bit unusual. So they ordered this test called a C-peptide, which actually measures how much insulin you make. And I was just making like a trickle. I'd never ordered that test as a family doc. I had to go kind of look it up. They had a research arm of their endocrine department. And then they put a continuous glucose monitor on me. They had back in 2012, 13. These were like pretty big and bulky. You had to download the data. But I was a runner, so I was, eating your carb heavy diet. And what I saw immediately was, half of that bowl of cereal I would eat would take my glucose up to about 250, but I was highly insulin sensitive. So there's a first phase and a second phase insulin response. So my first phase really was non-existent, but I had a little second phase, and then I would crash down. And I was the guy who'd be like hoarding muffins at every, the drug companies were always bring, all this stuff in, but I would hoard a bagel or hoard a muffin. I was waking up at 2 a.m. every morning needing another bowl of cereal. And I just thought it was because I was burning a lot of calories. I was actually losing weight and eating probably like 8,000 calories a day. It was really bizarre. But as soon as I saw that data on what was happening with the glucose and the glucose monitor, I turned the food pyramid upside down like in a day and was able to stabilize my blood sugar. But most important thing, like I hadn't realized what it felt like to not be hungry all the time and to have stable energy and be able to eat dinner, not have a snack at night like I was doing, which was a carby snack, and actually sleep through the night and wake up in the morning and actually be able to go for a run in the morning, and then come back for breakfast. It was new territory of something I didn't understand. And I brought that back, into my civilian job. And the consequences in the military. So at that time, I had about 5 more years left in my career, maybe 6 more years. But if you have diabetes or you're on diabetes meds, you're discharged from the military, medical discharge. And I really loved what I did. Part of my job is training, these combat troops to run and move efficiently, because these are like the human weapons out there. And these guys are like definite paleo warriors, because they're doing low carb paleo diets. They don't even know what it should be called. They just know that whatever that cadre, that senior leader, hey, what do you eat when you're dropped out of a plane and you're not going to get picked up for 7 days? It's all fat and protein, because those are the super nutrient, energy dense foods, and they need to run on fat, and it gives them mental clarity. And there's research now into actually supplemental ketones with these special operator type forces, because there's a special mental clarity that you have if you're actually in a healthy level of nutritional ketosis. And, when you have to be fully aware of your situation at every minute of the day. So, figured it out, stayed in the military, and was able to retire without a medical board. What's changing now, I think, in diabetes care? So 2017, this is the standards of care, ADA, complex chronic illness, continuous medical care, multi-risk factors. Does not sound hopeful. Now we go to 2019, and I think this sentence is important. Reducing overall carbohydrate intake for individuals with diabetes has demonstrated the most evidence. Let's repeat that. The most evidence for improving glycemia may be applied in a variety of eating patterns that meet individual needs and preferences. This is about a 140-page document, but I wish this was known across the board to all healthcare practitioners. So if anyone now is recommending low carbohydrate diets for their diabetes patients, they're not out there rogue. This is in the guidelines as the most evidence. And if you want to come off medications, reducing overall carbohydrate intake. And that shouldn't be rocket science, right? If you want to come off your diabetes meds, you're treating the food with the meds. Stop the food. Again, read the article. It's diabetes care. They kind of put it in soft languages. They never come out and say, well, we were wrong. It's always updating the guidelines. It always sounds a little more soft, but I don't think people really keep up with these papers. This lady's bold. She's the ADA CEO, and she went on a podcast talking about her low carb diet. Pretty much what a lot of this conference is teaching. Just bread's a carbohydrate, pasta's a carbohydrate, fruits. And she was able to put her diabetes into remission, toss the bun out. This is the ADA CEO talking about this. And who funds the ADA? Pharma, right? So she got a lot of pushback for this, right? Because the pharma is very happy to keep the status quo, and they'll give out these plates of diabetes diets with a quarter of it being grains. Because if you eat those plates that the pharma reps will hand out, you will stay diabetic. You will never make it go away, and that's good for business. And I'm not a conspiracy person here, but that's just the honest truth. Anything presented by pharma is not for public health. Any research done by pharma is not for public health. It's for shareholders' benefits, period. It is not for public health. So the cost is staggering. The cost is staggering. Our kids and our grandkids, and even us if we're young, society can't afford diabetes. It's breaking the bank. You know, the average patient with diabetes costs $17,000 per year. And that isn't even some of the other comorbidities, which aren't considered diabetes, you know, if they need a cardiac stent. The cost of care for healthcare of the federal budget is 2.9 trillion. 9.7% of our GDP now is healthcare. You know, and we want to have good roads, we want to have good benefits, we want to have good schools, but the more we're spending on healthcare, that stuff's not going to happen. So let's talk quickly about, okay, can we make diabetes go into remission? And we know this is true, based on it, primarily right now, you know, non-debatable, the first two methods here will make your diabetes go away. So if I take your stomach and intestines out, your diabetes goes away in a day. You know, I don't say that disrespectfully, but that's true, right? If you come into bariatric surgery on 4 diabetes medications, they will stop them the day before surgery and probably not restart them because you're on like a liquid fast for 8 weeks. Or I could do the liquid fast. This is a study called Direct. You know, they did a 12-week, 800-calorie a day protein-sparing modified fast, which is high protein, low fat, low carbohydrate drinks. And they stopped, when they did that trial in the diabetes patients, all diabetes medications stopped at the onset of the trial. Now, some might have needed a little bit added back, but the majority, they never needed them back while they were on that diet. Now, the low-carb diet can also put diabetes into remission without either of those two top ones there, which I believe are more extreme than eating salmon, salads, eggs, meats, which sound like delicious foods. You know, the research has been there. Virta Health is probably the lead in this area, Virta. And if you just go onto their website, they've got a number of studies published. I've got databases of studies on this too. So usual care, diabetes will not go away. So if we just do the status quo and tell people to have 60 grams of carbohydrates a day, it will not go away. I mean, shouldn't be too surprising. What got you there will not make it go away. You know, so diabetes control has stalled across the US. For all of this increase in cost and more medications, we're not doing any better with diabetes care and control in A1Cs. So we're doing something wrong, spending more, doing worse. So we have to relook at it and not keep doing the same thing. So I'm not going to go through these slides, but these are just showing you the data on these different methods. This is low calorie diets with protein sparing modified fast. Now that to me sounds pretty extreme. Not many patients in rural West Virginia are going to be willing to do 800 calories a day in shakes. Like just the thought of that is setting their stress hormones up. But low carbohydrate nutrition, you know, which is mostly a ketogenic style diet, there's not a keto diet. Nutritional ketosis is a metabolic state, meaning as your body starts to mobilize and oxidize fat with that low insulin state, you start to make ketones through your liver. So there's not a, like on the web, there's a keto diet. No, that's not true. Your body makes ketones if you're in the correct metabolic state. And I don't have people here in West Virginia measuring ketones. I just try to get them to understand the foods that will allow them to access their body fat. Yeah, so about 60% of patients who do this will be off of all of their diabetes medications other than metformin, and have their A1Cs into a non-diabetic range at 2 years. This is the Virta trial. You know, and what is low carbohydrate nutrition? Because if you read the literature, there's studies that'll call a 40% carbohydrate way of eating a low carb diet, but that is not a medical low carb diet. You know, so really these people that are so severely obese and insulin resistant, you've got to get them really low, you know, less than 30 grams a day in their induction phase, because their liver is just so chock full of fat. That takes a little bit of time. Then maybe you can kind of go up into this space a little bit, 50 to 100. But if they're at, you know, 30%, the average American now has, it's like 250 grams of carbohydrates a day. So that's just, you know, phenomenal amounts of carbohydrates. But so 150 might be considered low, but it's not low enough to get the insulin low enough to be able to release. Insulin's a fat trapper. So you got to, it's like a dam. You got to get it low to be able to release the body fat. Troublemakers, so maybe some of you out there listening are a little bit of a troublemaker, good trouble, right? So in medicine, we really follow this consensus opinion, and if the consensus agrees the consensus is right, then nothing ever changes, so if you're willing to defend yourself, with the evidence, with how you live and how you practice, feel fine to be a little bit of a troublemaker and a dissenting opinion. In the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the dissenting opinion. The consensus makes better decisions if you have a good dissent, to be able to challenge the consensus. And then maybe the consensus opinion is right, but we haven't had good challenge to consensus opinion. This was a presentation I gave for a group of spine surgeons, National Academy of Spine Surgeons. So they're not allowed to do elective spine surgery now if patients' BMIs are greater than 40 and their A1Cs are greater than 7. So this is Carrie Diolis, one of the first female spine surgeons ever trained. She's a type 1, Andrew Kutnick's a type 1 diabetes patient. And Jim McCarter was one of the founders of Verta. And I work at WVU alongside a lot of our surgeons. So the surgeons are very interested in how do we get these patients, because they want to help their patients. But if their BMIs are 50 and they're fully diabetic and they need spinal surgery, until they can get those parameters improved. So they were very interested in what we presented, and we had an hour presentation, and they kept us an hour at lunch for Q&A. And that was just refreshing, just hearing just the empathy of these physicians just wanting to help their patients, and how can we do this in our clinic. And what I kind of came away with, in which I see my own practices, is our patients need support. And Vivian mentioned that too. So you could make some protocol guideline food lists, but if people don't have support, whether it's from the medical side or at home, it's very difficult to do. So if you're in practice now, support your patients, reframe type 2 diabetes. Previous, this is a progressive disease, lots of medications, lots of complications, it's despair. But if you can get your patients to believe that they can make this go away, and this lifestyle change is sustainable for the rest of their lives, you can get the medications away, prevent complications. If they leave that office, and if they can affirm that they think they can do it, then they have a chance of doing it. If they don't think they can do it, they don't know about it, their odds of doing it is 0. And it's just like any condition, they're going to relapse. They're going to fall off the rails a little bit. I'll use this phrase with people, this from Richard Bernstein, everyone's fear factor of all your diabetes complications. And that's a lot of the screening of diabetes. Get your foot exam, get your eye exam, get all this screening for the complications. But well-controlled diabetes is the leading cause of absolutely nothing. Well-controlled diabetes is the leading cause of nothing, and that gives patients hope. But this diabetes is metabolic disease. It's just one of the arms of the branches of the weed. But think about it, in 1 minute, write down all the diseases that are now common that would have been rare 100 years ago. It's probably some of you yourselves or your loved ones have a multitude of these, right? You got them all, right? These are the metabolic syndrome, insulin, high insulin state problems. It really starts in the liver. It's like the silent scream of the liver. 1 of 3 kids in my state leaving middle school already has fatty liver. They're on their way to diabetes. Sleep apnea travels with that too. You aren't what you eat. I think this is one of the biggest fallacies kind of out there. None of us are what we eat. We are how our bodies metabolize what we ate. This is a concept too, I think it's important. So just understanding these carbohydrates. So if you check your glucose and it's 100, for example, that's milligrams of glucose, deciliter of blood. We have 5 liters of plasma volume. So if you do the cancellation out, you only have 5 grams of glucose in your bloodstream. That's 1 teaspoon, tightly regulated by insulin, 1 teaspoon. That's nothing. And if your body can regulate that, you're fine. But if it can't, you're heading toward diabetes and you're going to break your metabolic health, because this is like a constant siege. To render us out of homeostasis. So the modern living is a siege against our homeostasis, and this is that visceral adipose fat and all the conditions that travel with that, and this, everyone needs to know their own markers. This is that 88% unwell. How many of you here are completely normal in glucose, blood pressure, waist circumference, triglycerides, HDL. You got none of those things. If you have none of those things, Gerald Raven studied this, you might just die of nothing. People don't get anything. They don't have age-related diseases. The people that are highly insulin sensitive, these are the markers more specifically. These are the conditions. Joseph Kraft studied this extensively in the 70s. These are the insulin patterns. So your glucose might be okay, but if your insulin is shooting up, you are becoming diabetic. This is a glucose tolerance test and different patterns. So he would measure the insulin response and then match it with autopsy studies. And he called it diabetes in situ and had this to say at the end of his career. He said, those who have diabetes, who say they do not have cardiovascular disease, are clearly undiagnosed. Meaning they just they don't know they have it. It's silent. A coronary artery calcium score can show this. I got a few more minutes, then we'll kind of go into questions. It's so much here to talk about. But okay, well, why do some people tolerate 30 teaspoons of sugar with every meal? A teenage football player, right? They're highly insulin sensitive. The muscle and liver are fine. They can throw a whole pizza in their body. Glucose goes up a little bit, insulin goes up a little bit, knocks on the door, stores it in the muscle and liver, go play football the next day. But as we go through life, stress, hormonal change, circadian mismatch, menopause, menopause, which happens in men, not quite as quickly as women. All the other unknowns and knowns that Vivian talked about, all those other markers of inflammation. Now you're carbohydrate intolerant. So now your liver's filled already with fat. You throw 30 teaspoons of sugar in your bloodstream. Now your glucose goes up, but now insulin has to start cranking up to clear the bloodstream, start cranking up. And as it does that, the resistance goes up. It's like tolerance. The more resistance, the more insulin on you go. This is Raven, right? So Gerald Raven, 1,000 scientific papers. So we look at type 2 diabetes and the complications of type 2 diabetes and the complications of high insulin state. So we kind of traditionally in medicine, we think of the type 2 complications as the high glucose, the glycation complications. This is retinopathy, kidney disease, neuropathy. But then there's the high insulin state. This is really that inflammation, that growth, hypertension, stroke, cancers, fatty liver, sleep apnea. So it's kind of a little bit of both. And cardiovascular disease is a micro and a macrovascular disease. So again, like all this stuff starts coming together when you understand insulin resistance. Again, more insulin, more carbs, more insulin, more resistance. It's like a vicious cycle. Now, to be able to release that fat, you got to get insulin really low, and then you can start making energy. So a health, I think, just think about this, and maybe this will be one of our final thoughts before questions. What is health? So a healthy body is what's called metabolically flexible. Okay, so that means when you need energy, you can make it from your own body. Right? Think of old school days, right? You'd have dinner, you wouldn't snack at night. You'd wake up in the morning, and if you worked on a farm, you probably had to do 2 hours of chores before you had breakfast. So your body's making energy. Your insulin's low, you're making energy. That's how my body works. I wake up, I go for a run, and my body makes glucose. My highest sugars of the day are after a run, fasted, because my body's making glucose. Now, if you're metabolically broken and your insulin's up all day and we're giving you more insulin at night, that's probably the biggest catastrophe to modern diabetes care, are big doses of night insulin. Because if I'm giving you a lot of insulin at night, or you're snacking carbohydrates at night, your insulin is up all night. So when your body should be using fat as fuel, you can't, it's trapped. So you're needing to eat energy. You can't make it. So really important concept to understand. And everyone's going to have a little different level before this kind of dam breaks. A very muscular, athletic person might be able to have 100 grams of carbohydrates who's exercising 2 hours a day or has a physically active job, because they're just putting away the glucose, insulin independent. Now, if you have a retired 70-year-old who's sedentary needing a hip replacement, that might be a different story. Elephant in the room, insulin resistance. These are all the conditions that travel together. Preventing and reversing this, right? So eat real food, avoid processed food, avoid sugar, refined carbohydrates, vegetables, healthy fats, and obviously what Vivian was talking about, the activity, sleep, and stress, pure nutrition. I'll go to that. Yeah. So, I mean, this is really it. Eat real food, but you have to understand If you have diabetes, those real foods can't be the sugary ones, so there's starchy and non-starchy vegetables. You want super nutrient dense foods, not just energy and calories over here. 60% of what Americans eat is ultra processed, and that's Michael Moss just wrote an amazing book called Hooked. Robert Lustig, Metabolical, two good reads that if you want to read about this. Now, people will kind of put you into a camp and they don't understand what you do. So they say, oh gosh, Mark thinks all carbs are bad. And that isn't true at all. Junk food is bad. So if you look at carbohydrates, they probably ate, going back, several generations. These were the carbohydrates, right? They're vegetables, fruits, roots, legumes, nuts. But now the carbohydrates are refined grains, and just junk food. So if we all did this, we would have been fine, but if we're not. How to make an obese anything? High fat and high carb in the same meal. That's the Western diet, the processed diet. So they have a lot of carbs, raise the insulin. Then it's like a packaged muffin, right? It's like 600 calories, loaded with processed fats, loaded with white flour and sugar. So that just stores. So highly calorie dense, highly energy dense. You're going to store that. That's a school lunch. This is what happens in our schools. Carbs and fat together will break your metabolic health. We're at 4 o'clock. Maybe I'll just pause and stop there. Prioritize protein. The cost of protein is higher. So when we're looking at policy, we have to figure out how to advise and help people get good quality protein without super high cost. Time restricted eating. We could talk about this in the discussion where this fits in. Yeah, there's just so much cardiometabolic health with low carb diets. This will improve your cardiometabolic health, not make it worse. So eating the eggs and the healthy fats will not clog your arteries if you look at these parameters, cardiometabolic health. Medications, this will be, then we'll go to questions because I think this, just look at the slide. We could do this in the Q&As. So if you're treating people, you got to know which medicines to stop and lower because, and this is a paper we just published, because if you're on big doses of insulin, we tell you to stop your carbohydrates, but you're not willing to manage the meds, they can have complication. Obviously, they would get low blood sugar. So anyone who's having active management of carb reduction on medications needs a clinician who understands the medications. So if you're out there, a health coach or an allied health person who doesn't prescribe, you need to find a partner in your community. All right, we're done and we'll go to Q&A. I know it's a lot of stuff, but I know you go on for days about this stuff, but I hope I gave you just a little flavor. Didn't even get into the case studies, but I hope I gave you a little flavor of the science.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much. And such a hopeful message. And it's such an important message that people need to know there is an option out there and that this can be reversed. And so, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. Thank you, Peggy. Well, welcome to our final session of the conference with Dr. Vivian Lowe and Dr. Mark Cucuzzella. My name is Jim Lenny. I'm a retired gastroenterologist and a board member at Agraria, and I'll be your host today. I would like to start the discussion off with something that Mark had alluded to. So the US healthcare system spends $3.5 trillion a year, the highest per capita of any country in the world. And yet we have this unbelievable obesity and other diet-related disease problem. Why do you think that is? Why have we spend that amount of money and have actually gotten a much, much sicker society than we did 50 years ago?
I don't know if maybe I'll chime in first, that Vivian tag on. I mean, we're a fee-for-service system, and our medical system is highly influenced by pharma, and big food highly influences policy for things such as the dietary guidelines and what's in stores. So if you have a toxin that's affordable, accessible, and acceptable, like cigarettes were 20 years ago, and we know it's causing disease, we make them less affordable, less accessible, and less acceptable. You can't smoke in hospitals now. But our toxins we put at the checkout counter and the end caps and highly discount them. And we allow people with SNAP benefits. Mountain Dew in my state is that #1 item purchased on SNAP. Soda is the #1 item purchased with federal dollars. So we're using federal dollars to create a sicker society. So unless we get pharma and big food in the game to prevent this stuff, so how can we incentivize the food industry to make foods that are affordable, that don't create a diabetic population? So it goes, I testified twice in front of the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee. And I think Vivian, did you testify there too? Yeah, we had like 5-6 clinicians testifying in 3 minutes, but the rest were lobbyists. So I knew which direction it was going to go. They weren't going to, have as an option in the dietary guidelines a low carbohydrate option, even though 2/3 of this country are medically obese. And the people that need advice are not the people who are well. If you have people who are well, like our grandparents were, they didn't need the government's advice on how to eat. It's the people who aren't well need her advice. So the whole thing's upside down. That's just the beginnings of it. Robert Lustig, read Metabolical, read Hooked, read anything by David Ludwig. These are, he's Harvard endocrinologist. They go into some of the policy suggestions, like what would it take? That's why we can't, if we're going to flatten this curve, we have to apply like Manhattan Project level of thinking, meaning we're all in, right? That's how we got a coronavirus vaccine, right? You lock the smartest people in the room and you get the science right, and you don't leave the room until you get it right. You can't just work around the edges and, tell kids to eat more fruit or something and think it's going to reduce obesity. Telling anyone to eat more of anything, at least in my opinion, isn't going to reduce obesity. But that's, I don't know, Vivian, what else you want to throw in there?
Yeah, Vivian, it seems like our system is clearly broken and there's the wrong motivations.
There's no
out
incentives.
there.
The financial incentives are more care.
Correct. We get paid for the care that we give. So do you have any insights or suggestions in how we might change the direction of our current healthcare model?
Vivian, let's see if Vivian, you want to throw in any? You've been working a long time too. Those are just some observations I have.
Well, I totally agree with you, Mark. I'm going to be less delicate and just say that nobody gets paid in the healthcare industry when you're not sick. Sorry. We only get paid when you're sick. So if that is how the system is set up, well, then everybody's incentive is to have lots of sick people, put it bluntly. And I think when you structure the healthcare system that way, and the incentives are geared towards keeping people sick, then you're really, we shouldn't be surprised. And in fact, I think then that we should expect that more people will get sick, right? If we think it through.
Yeah, then the industry wins. Yeah, we don't have a national healthcare system. I think until we have some type of a national healthcare system, I don't think that, I don't think this will go away. We need some incentive of population health.
So, in way back in ancient China, right, the emperor's physicians, it was off with their heads if the emperor got sick, right? Because you guys are not doing it, right? If the guy's sick, the emperor's sick, then you're really keeping on the job. So you're done, right? Imagine if that were our system. And unfortunately, we don't teach prevention. And actually, let's just say we don't even know what health is, because health is merely defined as absence of sickness in our current system, right? So nobody really has even a good definition of health. The medical school system is prioritized, again, towards the use of medications. There's absolutely no curriculum around or thoughtful curriculum around nutrition, around lifestyle modification. So, when you have, a whole semester of pharmacology and at best an hour of nutrition, well, it tells you what you need to know about how we're taught to treat patients in the world.
So there's no
Can I
money.
say I love Vivian? I think she's much more, much more right to the point. So I need to hang out with Vivian a little more, just tell it like it is.
So Vivian, I do want to clarify one thing for our audience. Can you explain the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes so that people don't think they can necessarily cure type 1 with diet alone?
Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and your own immune system destroys those beta cells in the pancreas so that then you're not able to make your own insulin. Interestingly, though, there seems to be some relation to gut dysfunction. And prior to onset of type 1 diabetes, most patients will report some kind of gastrointestinal distress 2 to 3 weeks or maybe up to a month or so before the actual onset of type 1. So there is this suggestion that there's a gut link to the autoimmune disease. Type 2 diabetes is merely that you wear out your own beta cells, by overworking them if you're constantly forcing them to produce insulin.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, one other thing just to tag on. So, and there's other spectrums in between, there's maturity onset diabetes of youth, late onset diabetes of adulthood, and low insulin, high insulin states. But the bottom line is how we prescribe and how people eat is very similar. So I'm on that type 1 spectrum, and this is a glucose meter. And, so I could scan it in my arm and it tells you what my sugar is, so you can see my line. I'm like pretty flat, 111. But if my type 1s and my type 2s, 10 grams of carbohydrates will raise your glucose 40 points if you're diabetic. So that's a good number for people to understand. So what I would eat in the type 1 spectrum, having a C-peptide of 0.3, and a type 2 who's highly insulin resistant, is going to have the same effect on this monitor. It'll blow it up, and then the type 2s will take a long time to come back down. A type 1 tends to, a pure type 1 who's otherwise healthy, just not making insulin, they're much more insulin sensitive. So they're going to go up. And whether they medicate or if they make just that little bit of insulin themselves, they'll have that second phase insulin response that'll bring it down. But I think everyone who's diagnosed with type 1 makes a little bit of insulin. And there's case studies coming out now of we're not offering new type 1s low carb diets because there is some beta cell preservation if they had an autoimmune attack that is now no longer present. Something happened in gut dysbiosis or a virus, we don't know. But sometimes it's a transient phenomena that leaves you with a little bit of beta cell function. We call it the honeymoon phase with type 1s, right? We give them a little insulin, then they can come off their insulin. So there's usually always a little bit of beta cell preservation. And, just so, we need to give people options at the get-go of a low carb option plan and use a glucose meter. And if they can bring their sugars good without eating carbohydrates, maybe they can stay off of insulin.
Interestingly, before the discovery of insulin, really the only way to prolong the life of type 1 diabetics was the ketogenic diet.
Lockdown, yeah.
So, that was really the only way to prolong lifespan. I mean, they still died early, but it was all they had. And certainly if you're type 1, you should be doing a low carb diet only under, supervision of your doctor, a medical professional. But I will say that I think we oftentimes will assume just because someone is type 1 that they can't decrease their carb intake, right? And I don't think that's necessarily helpful. Even I treat type 1s and they have done very well and really, improved in terms of their sugar loads and so forth. That's, really in much better control. And just to reiterate, I heard because Mark was talking about how we have about 1 teaspoon of sugar in our bloodstream, 1.5 maybe, and a slice of bread, just so we have some comparison here, is 5 teaspoons, right?
Yeah,
and a bowl of cooked rice is 11 plus teaspoons. And the people with the really healthy brown rice, that's also 11 plus teaspoons, right? It's great marketing, but it's still carbs.
Yeah, whole grain carbs. Yeah, I put in the chat an amazing book, whether you want to learn about type 1 or type 2, is Dr. Richard Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. He was diagnosed with type 1 in 1946, was an engineer, or the first person to actually do home glucose monitoring outside of peeing on a stick, because he saw an ad for this machine that was a glucometer, that they were using in ERs to differentiate who was hypo and who was drunk. And he said, I want to get one of those. Started checking his sugars, presenting at scientific conferences, but he wasn't a doctor, so he was dismissed. So then he went to med school at age 46, became an endocrinologist, and he's still going to the gym now at age 86. So I'm listening to what Bernstein's doing, because no one else diagnosed with type 1 in 1946 is probably alive and going to the gym other than Dr. Richard Bernstein. Yeah, he still can do pull-ups.
That's great.
So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So whatever he's doing, I'm in, right? I'm a flight doc. So Chuck Yeager was the model for anyone involved in military flight, so if you wanted to stay alive doing that job, you read about Chuck Yeager, and you read, he's from West Virginia too, so we all love Chuck Yeager. He just passed away, but he knew he was a mechanic before he flew planes. So before he would take a plane up, he wanted to know what every bolt on that plane did before he would just arrogantly take the stick, right, and become a painting on the wall, in Tom Wolfe's book, right? You all know that in The Right Stuff, all the pictures at the bar of the fighter pilots and the test pilots, who went to ground. But
Sorry, excuse me, Mark. Would you mind speaking up?
Oh, yes.
Or
Can you hear?
get your microphone closer to.
Got it. But just talking about, I know what's going on under the hood. This Chuck
Thank
Yeager
you.
model, Richard Bernstein. Read the book.
Good. Dr. Lowe, I would like to get back to something you said during your talk about the racial disparities with regard to nitric oxide and the free radicals. And you were saying that, I guess it's theorized what leads to that, but you were suggesting that chronic stress may be a large factor. Have they tried looking at genetics and other issues as well on that, or how are they trying to, sort that out, why we're seeing that difference?
There's this thing. We hardly do, I think, enough research, right, on racial differences or ethnic differences. Most of our studies are still restricted to mostly white Caucasian males. So it's really hard to dissect out, what exactly is happening. And I think that's where we need to be devoting more resources, more research. I think that's what I was talking about in terms of, we often talk about racial disparities in terms of policy and social systems, and certainly they exist. But as a medical professional, I'm asking the question of why, as doctors, we don't know these differences well between ethnicities and how they might, for example, respond differently to different medications and so forth, right? How you might want to prioritize one approach versus another, so I would definitely be focusing a lot on decreasing oxidative stress in my African-American patients, and maybe, be more eager to use antioxidant therapies, just as an example. I mean, it was such a huge field, and, there are differences in terms of, our skeletal mass. There's differences in terms of, we can look at renal differences. I mean, there's just a whole range, bone density differences, and what does that mean depending on the ethnicity. So I think this is really a time for us to, sit back and think through, the fact that we haven't addressed these issues, and how do we incorporate it more into our training systems, into medical schools, into residency programs, and also how do we now invest more research into those differences.
Great, that makes sense. Okay, our next question, I'll direct this one to Mark. Somebody asked what percentage of their body weight must they lose in order to reverse their metabolic syndrome? And I guess at the same time, maybe you could go into one of your case studies to maybe give
Yeah,
an
so that's
example.
actually it's a great question. And Jeff Volek published a study, I believe it was 2018, showing you don't need to lose any weight to reverse your metabolic syndrome. You know, so there's not this, well, you have to lose 7% of your body fat or 7% of your body weight, you know, or else it won't happen. No, you can keep your same BMI and reverse your metabolic syndrome, you know, by reducing the drivers of your metabolic syndrome. And maybe that's just a matter, I mean, most just get rid of the liver fat and then they become more insulin sensitive. But if you have someone, say, go to the gym, right, even start some strength training, you know, they just reshape, right? They lose a little of that fat in the belly, but there is no magic threshold of weight loss that you need.
Can
So
I
you reverse the
jump in?
metabolic syndrome before maybe you might lose weight. So we have to remove the focus. But Vivian, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, just because this is an area of interest of mine. We do a lot of body comps. I have a DEXA. We
Oh,
do not go
nice.
by weight. Yeah, we do not go by weight. We look at the visceral fat. My preference is for the visceral fat area to be below 80 centimeters squared. And so for some people, depending on their risk factors, I may want it even lower. So generally, 100 centimeters squared and above is increased cardiovascular risk and risk for diabetes and cancer and so forth. Greater than 160 is extreme high risk. I like to get people under 80. And the idea now is to, as Mark pointed out, to look at the body composition, right? If you lose 5 pounds of fat, gain 5 pounds of muscle, your weight will be the same, but you will be very different metabolically. You'll be a completely different creature metabolically. So we need to be more nuanced when we talk about, about weight and fat, because it's really, not that number on the scale. We really have to take into account the bigger metabolic picture.
And I think they just published, it was like 2 weeks ago, they just published 7-year data on the, which was really looking at the DPP. It was the lean, what was the name of the study? But yeah, so the hypothesis was if you lost 7% of your body weight, your diabetes goes away. But so what happened in a year, it actually looked pretty good. It was called the Look Ahead study. So it was kind of like at a year, they were all praising this study, which supported the DPP, which was the Diabetes Prevention Program, which focused on fat and calorie restriction, which works for a year.
I will say that over time, over time, I mean, up to a third of that weight loss may be due to muscle tissue.
Yeah, they all gained it back. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's going to happen is actually now they're worse off, and diabetics already have a hard time.
They're worse off.
So basically, we're actually on a spiral downwards with if you're only focused on weight loss, right? And you're not looking at that whole body composition picture. I saw in the comment someone asking about BMI calculated from white Caucasians. So you're correct. A lot of times for the ICD-10 coding, we have to look at BMI of 30 and above for obesity. I will point out, if you are of South Asian, India, or heritage, then a BMI of 25 puts you as obese. Most Asians, 27 will clearly be in the obese. So we don't look at that here, and we're just very cut and dry, and it's one number. And I think if it's given people things to think about, hope you realize it's not as simple as that, and it's way more nuanced than that.
Vivian, can I ask you one other question about your comments about hypertension and vitamin C? So if you have a patient who has hypertension but has a normal vitamin C level, are you saying you would still recommend additional supplements above and beyond what's normal to try to bring their blood pressure down?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the half-life of vitamin C is 6 hours.
Yeah, it's not very long.
I'm not sure, what a vitamin C level is telling me generally. Obviously, if I see very low levels, I will supplement. But, even if it's within normal range, I'm not sure, I may have caught them at a certain time where we see some vitamin C, right? So I'm not sure. I tend to supplement. It's well tolerated, and generally, especially if you have additional stress, like an infection, or you've had poor sleep, I tend to prefer to go a little higher on the vitamin C. And then there's issues of people worried about kidney stones and renal function, and honestly I do keep an eye on that, but I can't say that's been a major issue at all.
Well, vitamin C is water soluble, so it probably shouldn't build up too high in your body, right? Won't you excrete?
I think they just worry about people with renal dysfunction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, I have a
question about a cord in there. I can address that one. The question about a cord, about the A1C loosening in a cord. Yeah, so most people probably don't know what a cord is. I believe it was published in maybe 5 years ago, but it was a study, large federally funded study, to try to look at tight control of type 2 diabetes with an A1C goal, using medications and looking at outcomes, hard outcomes. So A1C is not a hard outcome. Hard outcome is, do you live or die, or all-cause mortality, and cardiovascular mortality, cancer, these are called hard outcomes, not intermediary outcomes. So the hypothesis was, well, if we lower A1C, people will do better. But the study was actually stopped early. And what they showed was the more medications it took to lower the A1C, specifically sulfonylureas, high insulin, even the glitazones, they died sooner with lower A1Cs. Now, if you've listened to Vivi and I's talk, it shouldn't be too surprising, because if we're slamming you with more and more insulin to make your A1C lower, then it's not a good idea. Now, just letting people have high A1Cs is not a good idea either. So it comes back to, if we can lower your A1C without more medications, you're getting healthier. So it shouldn't be, well, let's just relax the A1C because the medications are not a good idea. It's like, no, it's nonsensical. It's like, well, no, stop. We learned from this. The insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemia is the disease. The A1C is a marker. If someone's on 800 units of insulin a day, we see patients on these crazy doses and they're gaining and gaining weight. They feel horrible. They can't make any energy, but their A1C is good. That's not good. But if we just let them eat donuts and their A1C is 10, but the medications are not good, that's not good either. So let's fix the problem. Let's get rid of the root cause. Most of it's dietary, but yeah, stress, sleep apnea, lack of physical activity, ethnic variations, but it's an important study to learn something from that just confirms the Gerald Raven work, that it's hyperinsulinemia has its other whole state of, nefarious consequences. And insulin resistance is the disease, right? Ben Bickman just wrote a really succinct book called Why We Get Sick. Ben Bickman, and just listen to him on YouTube, one of his videos. And he's an insulin researcher, so he explains it just beautifully about hyperinsulinemia. So I hope that answers that. Yeah, Why We Get Sick, Ben Bickman. That's a wonderful book, right? I give that book away to medical students. I have 2 books now that I give away. They check them out when they rotate with me. It's Metabolical and Ben Bickman's book, but then I've got a whole library of books, and I wrote a book myself. I'll have them read, which covers a lot of topics about health.
Within your 2 practices, where does bariatric surgery fit as a treatment for obesity?
Do you want to take that one first, Vivian, or I'd be glad to?
A third of my patients are referred by the bariatric surgeons after they have had the surgery, lost some weight, regained the weight. And so I welcome all patients. Listen, I look at it, it's a tool, right? And the patient and their doctor hopefully had a good discussion, and the patient made a decision that I respect. If they come to me and they need help, I'm there to do whatever I can to help them. I do feel that any tool you use must address behavior change, though.
Yeah, exactly. I have a number of patients referred before and after. We're trying to food addiction. So if we don't address, so many of these folks are food addicted, and we just need to be really clear about that. Now, one of the tragedies I'm seeing now, 5 years, 10 years out of bariatric surgery in some of these patients, is they're malnourished. You know, they may have lost some weight, they gained some back, but if we've done one of the more radical procedures, you know, which is called like a Roux-en-Y or duodenal switch, if you've removed the small intestines, if you've removed the small intestines, you know, well, let's just go to evolutionary biology. You know, we have a small intestine to absorb certain nutrients, and they become malnourished because they have all these nutrient deficiencies. You have all these complex labs. Now, I wanted to yell at my phone. It was on there was a podcast called The Curbsiders, which I really like, and it's an internal medicine podcast. And they were interviewing, you know, quote, the leading bariatric surgeon up at the Brigham, you know, big Harvard-y hospital. And she said in that podcast twice that it's the only effective way for weight loss, with extreme confidence. And okay, well, that was all fine, right? She does bariatric surgery and she has medical students rotating with her. But then and they were talking in the end, and this is what made me want to cry, because she's like, yeah, the most enjoyable part of my job is figuring out all the nutritional deficiencies that they have and how to, you know, sort that out. And I'm just pausing. I'm like, wow, these are iatrogenic complications. And if you're listening to this, an iatrogenic complication is a complication caused by medicine. So here you're making light, and it's a game that you have these people that you took their stomachs and small intestines out that have B12 deficiency, thiamine deficiency, iron deficiency, protein malnutrition, bloating, like you name the complication they're having. And it's a game to sort out what their problem is. And you're making light of that. It's a tragedy. And now I'll share one story with you that will make you it blew my mind, and I left defeated. So I was the American Academy of Family Physician representation at a policy discussion sponsored by the RAND Corporation at the Department of Health and Human Services, maybe 4 years ago. And all the leads in obesity in the country were there. You know, you had the CDC, American Academy. It was about pediatric obesity. You had childhood obesity centers, pediatric bariatric surgery centers. And somehow as a family doc, they invited me in the room. I was nominated by the AAFP, maybe because I was a disruptive voice. And there was a presenter there who led a bariatric surgery center somewhere in the Midwest. And she said this, that we put them on this extreme, because it's a very risky surgery in children from an anesthesia perspective. Okay, they have big, they have airway issues, right? So ectopic fat is in the tongue and the throat, right? They gain weight here, and their airway is really compromised. So it's risky surgery, this bariatric surgery, and morbidly obese. So she said, we put them on this extreme diet for 4 weeks, and they lose all of their liver fat, and they lose 10% of their body weight, and surgery is easier, safer. So I raised my hand. It's my only comment in the whole damn meeting because there's a bunch of bigwigs there. And I raised my hand and say, ma'am, respectfully, can you tell me what this extreme diet was? She's like, oh yeah, they eat meat, eggs, fish, vegetables, and cheese. And I just paused. I said, well, isn't that what we want kids to eat? And then I actually pulled up a study. It's like 4-week ketogenic diet prior to bariatric surgery. And buried in the discussion was this. What was surprising about the diet was that they liked the diet. So what does that make if you're there listening? Wait, they lost 10% of their body weight, liver fat went away, and they liked the diet. So what should we offer them? This is an extreme diet, right? It's what I showed you the pictures of, right? This is an extreme diet, like lots of salmon and farm vegetables at the farmer market, and maybe some avocado, and stir fry the vegetables with amazing seeds. So I'd left that room and I'm like, if these are it's like the Manhattan Project, right? You get all the smartest people in the room and you solve the problem. And I left, if these are the smartest people in the country to solve pediatric obesity, I'm in the wrong room. I'm in the wrong room.
Yeah.
And that was the room. That was the people I just cried. And I was like, well, on we go, maybe in 10 years. Yeah, and now they're advocating for more. And this lady who gave this podcast, you can look it up. I don't want to name names, just podcasters. Look, find it yourself and don't take my opinion on it. Make your own. But she was advocating in the end for more bariatric surgery to do it earlier. Because yes, diabetes will go away if I take your stomach out, if I take your small intestines out. But I'm not creating, in 10 years, when I see these people 10 years, 5 years out, it's a disaster. It's a disaster.
If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
These people are, and then they're medical patients for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
I mean, but again, like for some, they do it. It's the right thing. And I think if we can control their food addiction, the gastric sleeve, but again, the weight loss is not as good because you still have your small intestine. They can eat through that sooner. But if you have control of your appetite and control of the addiction, the gastric sleeve might be a better way to go.
I think I just want to point out that eating is not always related to hunger, right? There's physiologic hunger. And then there are other types of hunger, such as emotional hunger. And so I have many patients who can't tell what kinds of hunger they have. I have patients who are never hungry physiologically, right? But they're eating for other reasons to self-soothe and so forth. So I think it's a very complex issue. I can't say that, one thing is going to fix everything. I do think we have to look at the bigger picture. Obviously, I do prioritize nutrition. I do prioritize behavior. And then I think we can use different tools, but to use them judiciously and to use them intelligently. I am not, for example, against the use of medication. I am for the judicious and intelligent use of medication. I just think it becomes really a little, I have to say, laughable when someone's on 15, 20 medications, and this one's for the side effects of that one's for the, what are we doing at that point, right? And I think we need to sit back and think about what we're doing, look at the bigger picture and include the patient's behavior in there. And then we have these different options that we can use as tools to support us if we see fit, to use them.
Thank you. I have one other question. We're learning more and more of the power of the gut microbiome and how it may be, related to our thinking and to all kinds of functions throughout our body. And this is hearsay that my daughter's is at Cincinnati Medical Center, and she's doing some research. And she was telling me about a group of mice. They had a group of obese mice and a group of normal weight mice. And they did fecal transplants from the obese mice to the normal weight mice. And those normal weight mice became obese, and vice versa, from the normal weight mice to the obese, and they lost weight. So it seemed to be mediated through the gut microbiome. Is there research out there like that, or involving humans, or?
That was in 2013, and then they used humans and did fecal transplant to the germ-free mice with the same results, right? And then at that point, same year, FDA just said no more fecal transplant work because we don't quite know what we're dealing with. I kind of agree now, because obviously when you think about fecal transplants, you worry about infection risk. But, we never thought we might be, transferring a trait, obesity, mental health, there are many things now, depression, schizophrenia, associated with the gut. And if we don't know what we're doing, I think it was a good idea maybe to just take a pause. And, they are doing now more studies with autism spectrum and gut microbiome. So with the obesity, I haven't seen that work progress. Although I will say the same year, at the end of that year, 2013, there was one case report from the UK in a woman who had fecal transplant because she has C. diff that was not responding to antibiotics. And she was a marathon runner and was very healthy. After the fecal transplant, she luckily survived the C. diff infection, but for the first time in her life, without changing her habits or her diet, she became obese. So there's some suggestion that, that might be involved. And perhaps in the future, we could be doing, University of Toronto makes synthetic poop. So they culture out, the strains of healthy donors, and then they kind of make their own poop, and then they do that as a transplant. And they've used that mostly for C. diff. So maybe in the future, we will start seeing more of that kind of work. So I'm not sure, but hopefully we will be exploring that a little bit more.
Yeah, Robert Lustig and David Perlmutter write a lot about this also, protect the liver and feed the gut. So the purpose of fiber, fiber, which is in that apple you eat, not in the apple juice, is really that those carbohydrates feed the 6 trillion bacteria in your gut, which is its whole neurologic and endocrine system. So what we want to do just as a human species is, there's no quote healthy microbiome. There's whatever your microbiome is when you are healthy is good for you. And we know that the diversity of species in the Western diet is less than the rainforest of someone who eats a diversity of foods. So that's the role of fiber, is not to make you poop, but to feed your microbiome. So I know there's a large number of people now going like full carnivorous, no plants, no nothing. And, when you're fully diabetic, I think that's probably a reasonable plan if you want to do it, because you'll reduce your insulin resistance. But ultimately, I think, add some plant-based fibrous foods into your diet. But again, like everyone responds a little bit differently. I would say that I probably eat what would be called a plant-based diet, even though people think, I'm like this carnivorous, low carb person, but like everything I eat is on top of some plants. I'll just throw the meat and the salmon. If I make an egg dish, it's always got vegetables and avocado on top. So yeah, we eat plants and animals as humans, right? That's our human ancestral diet. We eat plants and animals. And the ancestral plants are not these modern GMO, super sweet, highly palatable, monocropped corn and wheat. Those are not ancestral plants in any part of the world. Yeah, lots to learn, right? That's why we have intellectual humility. I don't think you can just do a fecal transplant on someone who's not well and it's going to like take, and then they could go back to eating junk food. I don't think there's no hacks. I hate the word hack. Like there's going to be some pharmaceutical hack, but some company's going to want to do some study of some product they make for some short-term outcome and make everyone think, well, this is the new holy grail. I can just hack that and get it versus change your lifestyle, which is hard, right? This is discipline. It's not willpower. It's discipline. You have to change.
One of my concerns is people getting taken advantage of. The whole probiotics industry is, probably hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And unfortunately, we're just in the infancy of our understanding of the gut biome and what's, we don't even really hardly know what's normal yet. Yeah. And I think it's going to be many, many years before we actually know species of bacteria or species of fungi or species of protozoa that are associated with inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel or whatever. And yet people are being sold these, probiotics, which who knows, when you throw a few thousand organisms into a well-balanced milieu of trillions of organisms, that you're going to change anything or what, and they don't have to prove that through any kind of science-based research, since they're just
most of the gut bacteria or the gut microorganisms, as you know, really are quite finicky, and you can't really culture them easily. We know they exist if we look at the genomics and so forth, but it's not easy to grow them out. So the probiotics usually are growing out the species that are easy to grow, cheapest to grow, and there's a vast number of organisms that you really cannot grow out. They live in anaerobic conditions. They're, very fastidious in terms of temperature and things like that, and light exposure. So as you said, it's way more complicated than people make it out to be.
Mark, I don't want to let you go until I find out something. So in Cincinnati, we've been trying for a long time to sort of a farm to table program, trying to get higher quality foods into our public school system. And the industrial model, it's federal dollars that come in, so you have to get bids on everything, and it's absolutely impossible to compete, with the great big giant food companies. How did you get things changed in your hospital? I mean, that's probably easier than a school, but it's still a pretty big institution.
Yeah, I mean, my hospital, I'm at a 24-bed critical access hospital. So again, it's like moving a small rock versus if you went into Mass General. And it probably was like the wisdom of the crowds. So we had, I don't know, a dozen nurses who had lost 50 pounds, some actually 150 pounds, by just listening into the counseling we were giving to patients with diabetes. So after a couple of years of, patients, responding, and staff, right? Like responding in this amazing way. And then I had a very collaborative dean who had lost weight on a low carb diet. So my dean understood and had my back, and we presented this, and it went through. But unless you have, I think it's a bottom up, if you're going to make change in the hospital, it's a bottom up revolution, meaning you have to communicate, you have to have support of the people that this is the right thing to do, versus just top down saying we're getting rid of sugar. And then you just you do it, right? You just make a press, but again, like you're going to have barriers, same as the school. We have a farm. We're going to have another workshop this summer, farm to school workshop. So we're trying to find workarounds, against the policies that exist, because you can't get rid of the USDA, but you have to try to find some creative solutions.
Yeah.
It's called positive deviance, so you look for local solutions that work, and maybe we can share some ideas. Like if someone has an idea that's working somewhere, I want to learn about that. Well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Probably part of the problem in schools now is, there used to be the cafeteria people who prepared meals. That's all gone.
No, it's all
All they
prepared
do
now.
is
It's all comes out of a truck.
Comes out of a truck,
and it's in
maybe
a pocket, right?
Yeah.
And they don't even need a knife and a fork anymore, because that's more money, right?
So
They
you
just
can't
eat
bring
it
them.
from a
You
pocket.
can't bring them produce from the farm. They have no way of preparing
No,
it.
it's dangerous. It's highly dangerous because it might be contaminated.
Exactly.
But that
Yeah.
fruit that's in the heavy syrup that's in the can, that's,
Yeah.
that's a fruit, right? And that's encouraged. You don't have 5 servings of fruit a day.
Exactly.
And then they're following the guidelines that the American Academy of Pediatrics will put out. Have 5 servings of fruit a day, and they're having 5 fruit cups a day, and they count orange juice as a fruit, and ketchup's a vegetable. Pizza has vegetables on it. Yeah, I mean, we all know on this call it's nonsensical, but it's government policy.
Well,
someone had a question about glucose monitors up there too.
I didn't see
yeah,
that.
I think glucose monitors are kind of the wave of the future, because patients learn. So there was one about, CGM technology up in the chat. Yeah, so a little bit on CGMs. I have a YouTube talk on it on Low Carb Down Under that we could share, but I use a ton of glucose monitors, and we actually have a study ongoing now on diabetes remission, and we're almost done our study, 4-month pilot, giving new diabetics one of these Freestyle Libres, which you can get 2 of these sensors. So this is a continuous glucose monitor. It's a little sensor that sits in my arm. So you can get $75 for even cash for a month, which are 14 days. That's 2 14-day monitors, and this might be $50. But you can see what your individual response is to your food. So the technology has gotten more accessible, more affordable. And I think any diabetes patient who doesn't know their response to food should even wear one for a few months or a few weeks. And then they'll be like, oh my gosh, because they check their sugars maybe once a day or maybe not at all. They're told, well, come back in 3 months. You don't need your A1C 6.5. You don't need to check your sugar, but there are heart attacks waiting to happen but they don't know, right? They're told whole wheat bread, but they don't know, right? But when you can't unsee what you see, you know, so if you eat bread and you see your sugar goes up to 250, hello, don't eat bread. They have alarms, right? So it'll beep, you know, and so they'll learn, everyone will learn what's their response to exercise, right? Do they go up? Do they go down? You know, everyone's different. Gosh, some people might be able to eat a banana. Others will shoot up to 200, you know, because there's 30 grams of carbohydrates in a banana, you know, but it's very, yeah, the obvious stuff is just right there and they can't unsee it. But ask your clinicians for one. And if they, you don't need that, find a new clinician. You know, it's like having a dashboard on your car. You know, if I was checking my sugar 4 times a day for like 8 years until these became easier and just simple to use, and now it's like it's my friend, like it and I learn from it every day. And you can, you know, you can see from mine, as someone who doesn't make a lot of insulin, my A1C is not perfect because I'm on the type 1 spectrum. So this is my lowest sugar today is 101. This is my low point today, outside of the middle of the night. And when I exercised in the morning and my sugar went up to about 150 because my body makes glucose when I exercise, but but it's flat. So glucose stability is actually really important because glucose instability makes you more vulnerable to plaque rupture. You know, so for myself, if my A1C is 5.9, which isn't perfect, but my glucose is stable, my coronary artery calcium score is 0. So right now I've got no calcium in my arteries, no calcium. So I'm okay with that. Like for what I have, it's not a perfect blood sugar, but it's stable and I don't have calcium in my arteries. So, you know, I might die of nothing if I keep doing this. So I'll repeat my calcium score every 3 to 4 years just to make sure there isn't any plaque developing on my arteries. And right now it's still 0. So again, we're all our own N of 1. But yeah, it's play with them. They're so simple.
Right.
And we'll get the data coming out of our little pilot study is amazing. We have people who started A1Cs in 9-10 range in 1 week, no medications, blood glucoses that look better than my chart right there. they're like down in the 80s, flat, boring, and they're losing weight.
I just want to point out, just because we have been talking a lot about vitamin C, that if you supplement, you might see an false high.
It gives you a warning to not. So this monitor will tell me not to supplement vitamin C. I don't know the mechanism of that, Vivian. Why does the vitamin C?
It's the sensor and the oxidation on the sensor.
That's what it is. Because it always comes up when you put a new sensor. You know, if you're taking over 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, it might give you, and you have to click OK that you've read the disclaimer.
Because you know, when we supplement, we always expect the reading to be higher.
And we cross-check it again. Like if you have one of these, you should. In my bag, I have a glucometer, just your standard glucometer. So if something, you should always cross-check a little bit. You know, there's always variance in
glucometer too, Mark. I think
will that respond to vitamin C also?
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So
why we go to conferences, learn new stuff.
Probably a serum. Like
you need a vein, to venous sample. But it gives you information. You know, it gives you really good information.
We're getting close to the end of the program today. I can't thank both of you enough for spending time with us. You have talked about many things that I don't think a lot of us knew before and understand, and really excited to learn more about. Vivian, you want to leave us one simple message for us out here who are, you know, it sounds like we've all got metabolic syndrome. There's only 21 of us percent that don't?
12%.
12%. It's even worse.
12%, right?
Well, that's even worse.
Yeah, I mean, I do talk a lot about what I think we don't talk enough about is normal weight obesity. And if we're going by percent body fat, which, you know, by DEXA, not by the bioimpedance that your personal trainer has at the gym, but by DEXA, which is an X-ray. If we go by percent body fat, I strongly suspect the prevalence of obesity in this country is in the 90% range,
Over fat.
not
Mhm.
42%, okay, 5% body fat. So basically, I think, until proven otherwise, we should suspect that we have, some form of metabolic dysfunction to get tested. But even if you're having trouble getting your practitioner to go on board, I mean, some of the things I think that were mentioned in today's conference will go a long way in helping you get back on track, right? Eating real foods, eating a lower carb load. Institute of Medicine's RDA, I don't always agree with the RDA, but it's 130 grams a day. The average American eats close to 400 grams a day, 152 pounds of sugar per year. So, I think if we even go with the RDA, we still be better off, right? I mean, seriously, that would be, yeah. So I think those basic things and focusing on getting our bodies back to, I call it, the factory settings, right? Because we messed it up.
It's
So
normal.
go back, reset to the factory settings, and I think that would solve a lot of our problems.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mark,
Yeah, and I have a hard stop at 5. I'm here to build in a conference room at the kindness of a lodge because I'm on vacation. But I think hope and joy and find your tribe and change your identity. So when people start to restore their health, right, they kind of have viewed themselves, and society made them, they're defeated, right? They view themselves as unhealthy, overweight, fat, all this negative terminology, and that's their identity. But and they tend to kind of hang with people that have a similar defeatist identity. But when you get someone feeling healthy again and eating better, your actions change your identity. So the more you just do the same actions every day, that shapes your mind. Your mind can't overcome your actions, but you just line up every day and repeat, and ultimately you're going to change your identity and you're going to love yourself. So unless you're going to create a new avatar for yourself, and that's going to be you and who you are, and that's going to be a healthy identity. And when you've changed your identity, you're good, right? I'm a healthy person. I'm an athlete. I've got one patient who lost 180, 200 pounds. We wrote a blog on her, and she's like, now her identity is she's an athlete. She posts her workouts, and she's in the running group. It's incredible. Like, she's good right now. She's fine. She found a new tribe, went through some trauma, some serious trauma, right? Some relationship trauma, and now she's healed. So create a new identity. And that's where health coaches and support, without love, they'll never get out of this mess. But that's all I got for you guys. And I'm going to have to sign off here because I have to exit this, but it's been a privilege. And certainly with Vivian.
Take
Yeah.
care.
Yeah. Take care. You guys have a wonderful weekend. And thank you for the invite.
well, that draws to conclusion day 2 of our Nourishing Life conference. We are so glad to be able to be the host for this conference. And thanks again to everyone for your presentations, questions, and participation. We hope that as growers, healthcare providers, and community members, you have benefited from your time with us and feel inspired to become the change makers in your corner of the world. Have a beautiful and restful weekend. Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.